Welcome, young wizard. Tonight we follow the story of one of the bravest, kindest, and most unforgettable creatures ever to walk the halls of Hogwarts. Dobby, the house elf. He was small in stature, with wide eyes and a trembling voice, yet his courage burned brighter than many great wizards. From the chains of the Malfoy household to the freedom of a single sock, from the secret kindnesses he offered in shadows to the ultimate sacrifice he made beneath the stars, Dobby's life was a tale of love, loyalty, and choice. This is not just the story of a servant, but of a friend who stood against cruelty, who defied masters, who protected Harry Potter when others would not, and who showed the world that even the humblest among us can be heroes. So breathe slowly, let the night grow gentle, and listen as we walk step by step through the entire story of Dobby the Free Elf. Some say the first house elves were born in the echo of a hearth when a wizard thanked the fire instead of commanding it, and the gratitude made a little shape for itself and stood up, surprised, already smiling. Others say an old witch, weary of her bones and gentler than rules, spun a thread from midnight to morning and wove it into the air, and the weaving awakened those who love to mend and to tend, those who make edges meet. There are songs, none written or remembered, that speak of a bargain sealed with bread and salt, and a folded towel placed carefully on a threshold, as if a home might be invited the way a guest is invited, and in accepting, promise to keep itself alive. Whichever tale you choose, each one begins with a kindness, and from that kindness a binding grew, not iron, but ivy, not chain, but choice, that feels like duty. Welcome, young wizard. Tonight we follow the story of one of the bravest, kindest, and most unforgettable creatures ever to walk the halls of Hogwarts. Dobby, the house elf. He was small in stature, with wide eyes and a trembling voice, yet his courage burned brighter than many great wizards. From the chains of the Malfoy household to the freedom of a single sock, from the secret kindnesses he offered in shadows to the ultimate sacrifice he made beneath the stars, Dobby's life was a tale of love, loyalty, and choice. This is not just the story of a servant, but of a friend who stood against cruelty, who defied masters, who protected Harry Potter when others would not, and who showed the world that even the humblest among us can be heroes. So, breathe slowly. Let the night grow gentle, and listen as we walk step by step through the entire story of Dobby the Free Elf. Some say the first house elves were born in the echo of a hearth, when a wizard thanked the fire instead of commanding it, and the gratitude made a little shape for itself and stood up, surprised, already smiling. Others say an old witch, weary of her bones and gentler than rules, spun a thread from midnight to morning and wove it into the air, and the weaving awakened those who love to mend and to tend, those who make edges meet. There are songs, none written or remembered, that speak of a bargain sealed with bread and salt and a folded towel placed carefully on a threshold, as if a home might be invited the way a guest is invited, and in accepting, promise to keep itself alive. Whichever tale you choose, each one begins with a kindness, and from that kindness a binding grew, not iron but ivy, not chain but choice that feels like duty. In those early ages, before the proud estates and the cold coats of arms, wizards were afraid of the largeness of their own power. They feared it might spill and drown them as a river born from a rainstorm. The house elves, who could feel the fine stitches of household enchantment, offered a gentle answer. They would hold the river in channels made of routine, sweep this floor until the floor remembers it is a floor and not a pond. Warm this pot until soup learns to be a small sun. Lay this blanket just so until sleep discovers its way into sighing chests. These were magics of tending and returning, of putting right, and they placed a medicine in the center of wizarding life. That great magic is safest when brought daily to heal, by small, loving tasks. A pact took shape, not written in law books, but folded into habits and whispered into recipes. And the pact said, "We will care for your home as if it were our own. In exchange, you will call this caring a place, and you will invite us to belong within it." Names were traded the way keys are traded, with two hands. A master spoke the name of an elf as a house speaks its creaking to an old stair. An elf spoke the name of a family, the way the wind speaks to wheat. The pact did not begin as a collar. It began as a meeting of needs. Humans with restless magic, restless hearts, and tasks too endless to count. Elves with nimble magic, and the soft, stubborn wish to make broken things whole. But history is a tide, and kindness, if left unattended, can drain away and leave salt. Wizards grew taller in their halls. Their spells learned to stand sharply on one leg, then on none at all, dancing without music. The kitchens filled with copper and bustle. The caves became corridors. Portraits learned to speak. The stairs learned to argue. And somewhere along that winding, the pact, once a handshake by lamplight, began to be kept in the purse and in the fist. Cloth entered the story like a quiet instrument. A napkin placed just so, a curtain hem stitched with the family's careful thread. To an elf, clothing was not adornment, it was declaration. A garment made by the house was part of the house, as surely as lintel and latch. To be given such cloth freely, as a thing apart, was to be unstitched from the old promise, to be set loose into the weather of one's own choosing. There were good families who remembered the softness at the pact's root, who spoke to their elves as to old friends, and trusted them with secrets as one trusts a window with light. And there were other families for whom power grew heavy, and then comfortable, whose voices learned the habit of summoning like one rings a bell without ever listening to its echo. Elves, so keen to keep, kept on. Duty can grow elaborate, like ivy, around a pillar, until it becomes difficult to tell where pillar ends and ivy begins. Punishments found their way into the arrangement, self-inflicted, for elves are strict gardeners of their own vow, where a human might sin and excuse himself. An elf, missing a step on the staircase of service, would lash his heart with a switch of shame and call it setting things right. And yet listen, beneath the bustle of pots and the hiss of irons, beneath the hush of brooms and the tap of knitting needles, there remained a hum, a promise older than the twists of ownership, the first quiet promise made by firelight. Elves remembered it, the way one remembers an old lullaby. Even when the words have warped, they remembered that they had come into the world, not as prisoners, but as caretakers, that their magic was the magic of mending, and that mending is a kind of love. When the great houses rose, black-roofed and proud, ringed with hedges that trimmed the horizon to a private shape, so too did the kitchens grow deep and secretive. There were cellars where the air kept cool, even in summer. There were pantries where the shelves smelled of sugar and ink. There were sculleries with stone floors that told weather by the temperature of one's bare feet. In those hush-blue places, house elves moved like necessary shadows, speaking in the language of steam and folded corners, cataloguers of crumbs and comfort. They learned the turns of their master's tempers the way a sailor reads currents. They learned when silence would save someone and when speech, a tiny, brave speech, might turn a disaster into an inconvenience. Stories passed from hearth to hearth. One told of an elf who turned a sickness aside by changing the order of the spoonfuls in the broth. Another of an elf whose hands were small enough to unknot a ward that a careless child had tightened until it bit. Another told with a shiver and a secret smile of an elf who, when his mistress's sorrow grew too heavy for the house to carry, led her into the scullery and simply washed her hands with warm water until she cried and then slept and woke lighter. These were not grand magics fit for ballads. These were little lanterns carried down long, practical corridors. But little lanterns, steady and patient, keep ships off rocks. Time moved, as it does, and the wizarding world learned to measure itself in wars and weddings, in new laws and old grudges, in names that gathered weight like snow gathers on a branch. In one particularly grand line of wizards, fierce about ancestry, precise about possessions, their windows like narrowed eyes. The kitchens were busy even when the dining room was empty, for the house liked itself best when it was useful. There, in the measured clatter of this noble estate, an elf would soon be born who would carry within him that first firelit kindness, like an ember saved carefully in a twist of cloth. He would be small even for his kind, with ears like eager leaves, and eyes the green of bottle glass held to sunlight. The old songs would know his name long before he knew theirs. He would be called Dobby, before he took his first careful steps across cool flagstones, before he learned how to listen for a mistress's footfall in the length of a corridor, before ever his hands ached with the work that is love and the work that is fear. The world was already arranging itself around him. The manor had its tempers and its polished cruelties. The family had its pride like a blade kept bright. The kitchens had their own quiet republic, their customs, their little festivals. The day the first strawberries came in, the morning the preserves gleamed like stained glass in rows, and the pact. Oh, the pact was there, thin as silk, strong as memory, waiting to be tugged and tested, and perhaps one day retied. A sock, a scrap, a symbol would someday loosen the knot, but that is a far shortcut, and we are only now setting sail. So let us stand for a moment in that first light, with the dawn just rinsing the scullery windows and the kettles beginning to think about singing. And consider the long road a life can take when it is born between duty and tenderness, between the promise to serve and the longing, small at first, quiet as a mouse in a pocket, for something no one has yet named. The story of house elves began with a kindness. It will be led, step by step, back toward kindness again. Between those two gentle pillars will run a bridge made of one elf's choices, frail and shining, and if you lean close you can already hear the timbers settling into their work. And softly now, as the day's first loaf is lifted steaming from the oven, and a pair of bright eyes looks up to meet a world both welcoming and severe, we will breathe with the house, and with the small soul whom fate has set here, and follow the warmth as it threads its way toward him. For the next part of our tale belongs to Dobby's earliest rooms, and the family who taught him what service costs and what it means. The manor woke like a creature that preferred to pretend it had never truly slept, its shutters blinking with a deliberate laziness, its floors stretching with quiet pops where old timber remembered storms and summers, and in that drowsy grandeur, a very small pair of feet learned the language of corridors. Dobby's first lessons were not in words, but in listening. The sigh a door makes when it wishes to be handled gently, the brittle laughter of porcelain when teacups wish for warmer water, the hush a rug keeps when someone of consequence is gliding by. He learned the moods of brass, how knobs are cooler before a quarrel, how railings feel slightly sticky before rain, and he learned the gestures of the house elves who had been there longer than stories, elders with soft, careful hands and eyes polished by decades of steam. They taught him the grace of disappearing at the right moment, of being invisible without losing oneself, of shrinking one's breath down to a thimble so as not to stir the air where tempers lived. Their names were small as buttons, Tib, Pella, Nix, and they moved as if the house were a garment they had hemmed so often they could walk its edge with eyes closed. Dobby watched how Pella carried a tray with her elbows slightly lifted, a private sail catching kitchen wind, how Tib could pluck a coal with iron tongs and place it like a red syllable among the others, spelling warmth, how Nix could look at a clock and know by the tilt of its hands which master was about to call, and how far along his patience had run. Dobby imitated the tilt of the wrist that kept soup from sloshing, the sideways step that folded one into shadow when voices rose like weather. Above the kitchens, where the air learned to hold perfume and pronouncements, the family moved with the echo of rehearsed authority. Dobby learned their footsteps, the way a child learns the alphabet. There was the brisk, clipped rhythm of the mistress, heels like punctuation marks, the slower, sweeping progress of the master, whose cloak seemed always to be having a conversation with the floor, and lighter and quicker, a young master still learning how to make a corridor bow to him. In the creases of those footsteps lay a map of danger and duty. When the mistress's stride shortened, there would be questions sharp as pins. When the master's pace smoothed to a velvet glide, a guest would be near, and the silver must burn quietly with polish. When the young master skittered and paused, mischief was preparing its excuses and someone would be sent, soon, to make the mess look like fate. The work itself seemed at first like a series of games designed by a stern but fair-hearted spirit. There were grapes that must be peeled, so lightly their skins sighed rather than tore. There were windows that wanted to be seen through as if nothing ever gathered upon them but sky. There were boots that needed to remember they had walked only noble miles. Dobby approached each task as if it were a shy creature to be coaxed from a thicket. He sang to soap, very softly, and the soap made more honest bubbles. He spoke to dust with the courtesy one reserves for elders, and dust agreed to settle somewhere temporary, like a guest choosing a chair near the door. But houses, even grand ones, are not only made of duties that smile back. Dobby learned the sting of missteps as a language too. House elves hold themselves to the old pact with a zeal that wizards rarely notice, for few ever look closely at the hands that lay their comfort down. When Dobby chipped a plate, just a whisper of china at the rim, his ears burned with a shame older than the crack. and he sought the pantry's darkest corner to punish himself as custom demanded. A thimble of hot, bitter rinse pressed against the tongue, until he tasted a tension sharpen. When he forgot to fold a towel with the proper angle pointing east, he rapped his knuckles with a measuring spoon and whispered apologies to the linen press. The elders did not stop him, for to house elves, penance is a kind of tending turned inward, a way to keep duty bright. Yet Pella, passing, would pause and feel his back with a palm as quick and light as steam, and Tib would shuffle the measuring spoons into a different drawer, so the temptation to excess could not find him easily. There were the family's expectations, which arrived at odd hours and with the elegance of commands disguised as remarks. "The tea seems pensive today," the mistress might say, and Dobby would coax thoughtfulness out of the pot and replace it with cheer by altering the breath of the kettle. "The drapes are dreaming," the master would murmur, and Dobby would wake the velvet with a brush until it remembered the crisp dream of power. He learned that words like seems and perhaps were not invitations but veiled decrees, that a raised eyebrow could be a summons, that praise, when it came, was a gilded thing one must set carefully on a high shelf and never dust too hard. And there was the magic, quiet and close, that threaded everything. Dobby discovered he could nudge a flame a whisper, taller by leaning his thoughts toward it, smoothing the tongues of fire when they licked too hungrily. He could feel the way a room's ward tugged at the nape of his neck. Someone of the house approached. He could set a jug of milk to cool at just the pace the cream preferred by standing in a certain spot and humming a note at the edge of hearing. His magic liked being useful. It blossomed not with thunder but with care. When the master's study smelled of old paper and a growing storm, Dobby could shift the ink's mood to patient, and the quill would stop the little angry digs it made at the page. When the young master threw off his cloak and it lay sulking on a chair, Dobby could lift the garment's spirits with a flick, and the cloak would consent to remember its shape. He listened at the edges of adult talk, as house elves do, not to gather secrets for their own sake, but to protectorate the house from what secrets do when left alone. Names came and went like drafts under doors, ancient families, old allegiances, fashions in cruelty that walked under softer names. Dobby did not yet understand the chessboard of power that stretched beyond the hedges, but he felt the temperature of it in the way the dining room's long table absorbed light when certain guests arrived, and in how even the portraits watched more closely on nights when the master smiled too slowly. Yet within this ritual and watchfulness there were kindnesses, folded small, that nourished him like hidden fruit. Nix slipped him a corner of sugared peel on winter mornings, when breath smoked above the wash basins. Pella taught him a lullaby for kettles that kept water warm without letting it turn surly. Tibed, whose hands shook a little now, let Dobby carry the heavier platters and whispered, half to himself, "You handle weight like a promise." And Dobby kept that sentence the way one keeps a treasure in a pocket, touching it when corridors grew long. Once, in a moment that glints even now in the memory of the house, Dobby passed the young master in a hallway flooded with late afternoon. A beam of light, dusty and gold, reached across the runner like a lazy finger, and the young master stopped in it, considered the glow, and then kicked at nothing in particular with careless scorn, as if the day itself were an inconvenience. The gesture was small, but it taught Dobby more than a book might have about the world beyond his chores. He felt, for the first time, a little thread inside him tug toward a question that had no safe place to sit. He smoothed his apron and tucked the question away, for questions, in that house, were like sparks, useful near the hearth, dangerous in the curtains. Evenings were their own kind of ceremony. The house drew its drapes and gathered itself into composed shadow. Candles stood up straight and practiced not dripping. Footmen's shoes breathed out their day. In the kitchen, where warmth kept counsel, the elves finished the last elegant urgencies and allowed for a few minutes the soft unruliness of being. Dobby sat on an upturned crate and learned from the elders the lore that never reaches staircases, how to sense a letter slipping through a wall like a fish through reed, how to listen for the way a house chooses a master, just as much as a master chooses a house, how an elf may stand between a child and an unthinking spell, so subtly no one notices the saving except the spell itself, which relaxed grateful be prevented from becoming a lesson. There were nights when thunder walked the grounds, counting out distances to itself, and the mistress's bell would ring in a pattern that meant calm the mirrors, for they are anxious. Dobby would pad through corridors, where his reflection looked like a rumour, quiet the silvered glass with steadied palms, and whisper the old phrases that make surfaces kind. He became, without quite knowing when, a thread the house used to stitch itself together after every day's unravelling. And so the years gathered, pearl by pearl, onto a string he could not yet see, and the string was called belonging, and also called captivity. The difference between the two was a matter of light and angle, of who was looking and from where. Dobby kept working, kept learning the art of vanishing that keeps households from breaking under their own weight, and in the carefulness of his service he felt the faintest tremble of something else, something like a breeze from a door not yet opened, carrying a scent he could not name. It would be a long time before he followed that breeze into weather of his own choosing, but even now the air shifted, a breath, an omen, small as a whisper behind a wall. For in the days just ahead, the duties would sharpen like knives left too long to soak, and the shapes of punishment would stand up taller, and Dobby would have to walk their shadows without losing the ember he carried. And it is toward those tasks and the price of their precision that we drift now, one soft step at a time. Morning in that house did not begin with sun, for the windows wore their own weather. It began with the iron clink of the range catching, with the small roar of flame, learning itself again, with the hush of kettles that knew exactly how loud to breathe. Dobby woke before the waking, slipping from a pallet tucked where warmth gathered without boasting, and he stepped into the choreography the house demanded, a dance of ladles and cloths, of lifted lids and listening. He polished shadow from spoons until he could see the kitchen's lantern swim inside each bowl. He set bread to rise with hands that stroked the dough's shoulders, as if calming a nervous colt. He coaxed the pantry's cool into the milk, and knotted string about parcels, with a firmness that taught paper how to obey. Tasks accumulated like snowflakes that never melted, light on the tongue if tasted singly, heavy as a drift by day's end. There were floors that preferred to be scrubbed in circles no larger than a saucer, and grates that wanted ash removed in lines as straight as a ruler's dream. There were buttons on robes that sulked, unless flattered with the rough side of a thumb, and a library carpet that swallowed crumbs as if it were shamed by them, but required the crumbs to be discovered first, one by patient one, before it would release its guilt. Dobby learned to breathe with his whole back so his front could be given entirely to labour. He learned to move his thoughts like a lantern, setting them down where work was, lifting them, setting them down again, so that fatigue, when it arrived, found only a polite chair and not a bed. The family's rhythm pressed like weather. The master's bell had a timbre that made the air stand still, squares on the chessboard of the day suddenly visible, and Dobby had to move between them without knocking any piece from its pride. Bring the correspondence, the voice would say, but mean also, anticipate the letter, I will pretend to have mislaid, read in my face, the news I have not yet read, and soothe the room so that victory, when it arrives, feels inevitable. The mistress's call was softer but no less exacting. The orchids, she would murmur, and Dobby would understand she wanted not only water but the kind of attention that makes a flower believe itself loved by the right amount. Never too much, never like pity. The young master's needs were a different weather. Gusty, quick to change, shoes that must shine so that they could look down on other shoes, a cloak that must throw itself across his shoulders with the arrogance of a tame storm, quills that must bite the page and somehow not bite his pride. Dobby learned the trick of standing nearby without being seen, a watchfulness that could still a disaster mid-fall, catching a plate with a spell like a sigh, turning a spill backwards in time so that it never quite happened, knitting two angry threads in a conversation so that a breach became only a crease. He did these things because service was his craft, and because he could not ignore the tremor that ran through the household when temper was allowed to win. But the art of tending carried its own lash. Elves practice a strict liturgy of correction, as old as the pact, and twice as stubborn, believing that a task done imperfectly paints a bruise on the world that must be rubbed away with penance. When Dobby allowed the master's study to grow too warm, and the wax on the seal became soft and smudged, he sought the broom cupboard, and closed the door upon himself, counting out the breath it takes to feel the difference between shame and resolve, tapping his forehead with his knuckles, until the sound taught him attention again. When he misjudged the mistress's mood, and laid a braver dessert on the table than the evening could bear, something sugared and defiant on a night that required pale restraint. He ironed his ears for a minute, pressing heat to their tender maps, not to harm, but to inscribe the lesson, where it could not be misplaced. At times the punishments were not chosen by an elf's careful conscience, but suggested by a master's idle cruelty, the way one might tap a glass to see if it rings true. A command spoken with lazy severity could send Dobby to the hearthstone to sit without moving, until the house believed him stone as well. A gesture, 2 fingers, bored, could dispatch him to clap his hands until they stung, to keep them from forgetting whose work they are. These moments did not arrive like tempests. They came like drizzle, quietly unkind, dressing the day in damp that penetrates everything. Dobby endured with the awful skill of those who believe that endurance is the only instrument left in the orchestra, and he kept his small ember safe by wrapping it in attention. There were burdens, no one named. The portraits, who loved Judge as a hobby, could sting worse than nettles. There, watch it. Creature. One powdered ancestor would chirp, as Dobby passed with a tray. The left goblet is for those who earned it, as if even silver could be sorted into moral castes. Another, more lenient, would lean down and say, with a sigh full of centuries, "We all carry something, little one," which helped and did not help in the way old sympathy often does. And then there were the guests. Voices that brought in new climates of disdain, boots that carried other houses' dust and other houses' habits, laughter that treated the world as a board to be stamped with insignias. Dobby learned to read these importations, to adjust the room so that harm slid past without finding purchase. But he could not always keep the remarks from landing like thrown seeds, sprouting small weeds of doubt. Still, within the toil, grace showed itself in stitches. A teacup that sang when its saucer found it after a morning of being lost. A napkin folded into a bird that startled a sad child into brief wonder. Pella's crumb cake, cut in squares, so even they looked like a promise kept, cooling on a rack while rain thought aloud against the window. Tib's old joke, there are only 3 kinds of mess. The kind you see, the kind you miss, and the kind you make in your head, which made Nick snort and made Dobby think for a week. Those moments held the house together like hidden nails. They held Dobby together too. He discovered that burdens can be carried differently depending on the story you tell your bones while carrying them. If he thought of a scouring as punishment, his shoulders knotted like worried rope. If he thought of it as convincing the floor to remember its shine, his hands behaved like gentle teachers, and the ache afterwards felt like the ache of singing. He found he could make time itself more companionable by giving it names. The hour of quiet steam, the 5-minute kingdom of crumb, the minute where light comes through the pantry slats like ladders, and those small baptisms turned grind into liturgy. Even pain, when self-inflicted in the old ways, became in his mind not a cruelty but a chisel that kept the figure of duty sharp inside the block of habit. He did not yet know that one day he would choose a different set of tools that love could carve without wounding. For now he practiced the craft he had inherited with the tenderness and severity it demanded. Sometimes, late, when the house had tucked itself up to the chin and the last coal glowed like a small heart, Dobby would sit on the cool flagstones and listen to the breath of the manor. A house that old breathes in draughts, in the settling of beams, in the secret march of beetles inside the wainscoting. He listened for the places where breath caught, where worry lived, where something unsaid perched like a bird on a beam and would not fly. He pressed his small palm to the floor and felt, in the stone's patient cold, how time smooths even sharp tempers and turns even proud names into echoes. This comforted him, not because it made hardship less sharp, but because it placed hardship inside a story larger than the day's demands. He belonged to that longer story, as surely as the family did, perhaps more surely, for his hands touched what theirs did not know how to touch, and his care kept their world from fraying. Yet, the burdens bent him toward a truth he could not yet pronounce. Service, when holy, is chosen. When it cannot be chosen, it must be made gentle by those who receive it. In that house, gentleness was occasional, not polished, so he learned to make his own, pouring it into the crease of a bedsheet, into the temperature of bath water, into a lamp's wick trimmed so it would not sputter at a crucial moment. He gave away what he wished would be given to him, and in giving it, discovered the strange arithmetic of kindness. It multiplies even when dropped into the smallest cup. The punishments escalated in seasons. as though obedience were a crop to be harvested harder each year. There was the week of silence, when the master decided that sound itself had grown presumptuous, and the elves were to pad as if painted on. Dobby bound the clink from every spoon, stilled the gossip in the kettle, and learned how to set a tray down with a gesture that cancelled gravity's noise. There was the month of mirrors, when the mistress decided that the house looked older than it should, and Dobby spent hours persuading reflections to be kinder while hiding his own, for he could not always bear the sight of his small, earnest face repeating back labour's expression. There were days when the young master discovered boredom's cruelty and tossed it at the nearest living thing. Dobby learned the geometry of avoidance, how to be present the way a scene is present felt only if it is wrong. All of it pressed on him. Certainly, he is no saint in a glass window. There were minutes when resentment knocked, asking to be let in for tea, bringing with it sharp little stories about justice and desert Dobby. Remembering Tib's tremor, Pella's humming, Nix's dry jokes, would open the door, only a crack, feed resentment, a crust of honesty, and send it on its way without letting it look too closely at his heart. Better, he thought, to keep that small room uncluttered, better to leave space for something else he could not yet name. And yet, in the unnamable's direction, the world tipped just a little. On certain afternoons, the master's conversations grew more secret and more pleased with themselves. Owls came and went like thoughts wearing gloves. Visitors moved with an arrogance that believed itself heritage. In the edges of those movements, Dobby felt a chill that did not come from stone. He did not know the shape of what was rising beyond the hedges, but he could feel its draft under the doors. He tucked this too into the ledger he kept behind his ribs, next to the list of tasks and the catalogue of small mercies. So the days continued, and Dobby continued them. A thread in a tapestry that sometimes scratched the fingers that tried to smooth it, sometimes stung the eyes that admired it, always demanded to be mended from the back where no one looked. He carried trays and secrets, towels and tremors, bruises and lullabies. He believed because he must, that the pact meant belonging. He believed because he had to, that his punishments kept him true. He did not yet know that truth can be gentler than that, nor that belonging can be chosen like a door opened from the inside. But the house knew. Houses always do. It waited, keeping a certain corridor light a fraction warmer than it needed to be, saving a small brightness for the day when a name from beyond its pride would enter Dobby's hearing and show him a different measure for his labour, a different map for his small, stubborn heart. And as the bell in the master's room rang again once, twice, patient as a knuckle on a table, Dobby straightened, smoothed an apron that had learned his shape, and went to answer, the way he always had, only now with the faintest sensation that answering might someday mean something else, something wider, as if a hallway he had walked all his life had just in the corner of the eye grown another door. Kindness in such a house had to learn to walk on tiptoe, carrying its own shadow in both hands so it wouldn't be seen. And yet Dobby, whose heart was stitched with the old gentlenesses of the pact, could not help but practice a craft of mercies that pretended to be nothing at all. He did not announce them. Kindness is a quiet tailor, but he set them into the seams of every day until the garment of life fit a little better for those who had to wear it. He learned, for instance, how to click his tongue in a way the house understood as hush. And the door at the end of the children's corridor, where a small cousin visiting from elsewhere used to cry herself to sleep from homesickness, would take longer to remember its squeak. He memorized the part of the boot room's floor that was prone to cold rising like a bad idea, and he warmed it with an old kitchen charm so that the scullery maid standing there to lace up master's riding shoes would not start her morning with blue fingers. He swapped the mistress's favourite bell pull, which had a habit of blistering the palm when yanked in anger, for another braided in the old style. When asked, he bowed and whispered that the first was being mended, and returned the harmless one again and again with its tassel newly crisp, letting time make the lie look like tradition. He padded out small cruelties before they could bruise. When the young master discovered a particular pleasure in calling an elf from 3 rooms away and sending him back again with nothing to carry just to watch obedience move, Dobby found a way to answer from nearby more often than not. He reorganized the house's listening, coaxing walls to bring command to the closest set of ears, and when he could not, he arranged that the path an elf must walk to satisfy the pointless summons always included a chair back to steady himself upon, a moment where the light came through nicely, a breath in which the heart might remember it belonged to more than duty. He could not stop boredom from being cruel, but he padded the corners of its cage, He grew deft at losing certain objects that wished to be used harshly. A cane, more opinion than walking aid, kept misplacing itself behind the green settee. A ring that liked to flash and dominate conversations developed an interesting habit of slipping into a shallow dish of lavender water before guests arrived. A cold and lovely hand mirror, famous in the family for encouraging contempt, found it silvering clouded when tempers ran high, as if it chose clouds for company rather than reflect a storm. When the master grumbled, Dobby bowed to the dust motes and blamed the weather, which, being English, accepted the accusation. Such rebellions were careful embroidery on the inside of a hem. They had to be. Elves judge their own disobedience more fiercely than their masters ever could. They carry the weight of the pact like a bowl filled to the brim. Yet the older elves, Tib with his tremor, Pella with her hush, saw what Dobby was doing and did not unteach it. Pella once passed him a folded napkin for the mistress's lap and murmured, "Your fold holds," which meant in kitchen language both the linen and the household sat straighter because of him. Tib, watching Dobby intercept a quarrel by adjusting the height of a candle so that the room remembered how to be flattering, breathed, "There are faults only warmth can correct," and Dobby kept the sentence like a charm under his tongue. He listened for breaking points the way a shepherd listens for wolves. The laundress with raw hands, who pretended to prefer the hottest water because pride wore its own bandages. Dobby enchanted a cake of soap to soften as soon as it knew her touch. The footman who always flinched at thunder. Dobby taught the dining room curtains a fold that dampened the first drop's drumbeat. The kitchen boy who practiced jokes on the small because he feared being small. Dobby left a tin soldier on the boy's pillow, whose painted eyes looked brave. The boy began to borrow that courage instead. These were not grand gestures. They were repairs, the kind that keep a day from splitting open at the seam. Sometimes kindness had to lean into mischief to live. When the young master demanded a spectacle at supper, a floating display of silverware marching like soldiers, Dobby made the Fawkes march. Certainly, but he taught them a silly step so that the room laughed and Scorn had to sit down and be quiet for a minute. When a guest spoke about elves in the way one discusses weather, predictable, beneath notice, Dobby arranged for a draft to lift the guest's napkin onto his shoulder like an adoring pet. The table tittered, and a small seed of ridiculousness took root where contempt had been growing too comfortably. There were lines Dobby would not cross. He would not tamper with magic that watches and remembers, for such spells can turn on a house if they feel betrayed. He would not endanger the elders, whose bodies were already a ledger of every year's demands. He would not unmake the pact. He still believed in its earliest promise, like one believes in an old lullaby sung off-key. But he would not let the pact be used as a blade, either, when he could help it. He became a weaver of detour. When harm hunted straight lines, Dobby gave it corridors that turned gently until harm arrived somewhere tired and inconvenient, uncertain why it had set out at all. He nurtured the smallest pleasures as if they were seedlings that might grow into shade. He arranged an afternoon where by accident 3 elves finished their tasks at the same moment and found themselves at the back door when the pear tree was dropping fruit. They ate together, the juice running down their wrists, and for 5 minutes the house felt like a less complicated idea. He timed the steeping of the mistress's tea so that her best moods coincided with the hour when the gardeners passed under the window and could receive a nod. He tuned the pantry's darkness to velvet rather than pitch, so that entering it felt like a pause rather than a punishment. If anyone asked why the day seemed kinder, Dobby shrugged and blamed the pears, the weather, the recipe, the luck, even his punishments, for he still practiced them, still believed correction kept his hands honest. Grew less sharp around the edges when he began to understand that mercy makes better tools than pain. Where once he might have sought the broom cupboard to bruise his second thoughts into submission, he now stood at the sink and washed his own hands longer than necessary, warm water convincing stubbornness to turn into resolve. Where once he would iron his ears for a minute to remember protocols, he now pressed a cool cloth to his temples and repeated the old phrases about being small and steadfast, until pride, which is too tall to fit in a scullery, went to sulk elsewhere. He kept these changes secret from the parts of himself that loved old severity. He called them adjustments, as if he were tuning a kettle. Beyond the kitchen's orbit, the house's talk darkened. Owls with thin minds but important errands began visiting late. Names were spoken with a hush that was not reverence but calculation. Dobby could not track the map, Those names drew. He felt its draft all the same. He saw a new mark on the master's arm once. Only a flash as a sleeve slid back, and the room seemed to tilt, as if the floor both welcomed and feared the weight above it. Dobby set the inkpot a fraction to the left to keep it from trembling. He tucked what he had seen into the heavy drawer, where elves store the things no one must stumble over, and he pushed the drawer gently closed. On a certain grey morning, rain stalking the hedges like a thin-limbed dog, the young master flung a newspaper aside with a word that made the furniture wince. The paper slid under a chair and waited. No one asked for it. Dobby, clearing the crumbs a moment later, touched the page as one touches a sleeping bird. Headlines are loud even when they whisper. This one carried a name that made the ink seem warmer. He did not read elves. Do not presume. But the paper's breath contained a shape, a syllable that would appear again and again in the days ahead like a buoy appearing between waves. He felt it rather than learned it, a name like a candle lit in another room, whose light still manages to soften your own. The house had no patience for legends that weren't its own. It preferred ancestry to heroism. Yet even in such rooms, the world has a way of arriving by its smallest doors on a page blown crooked, in a sigh that forgets to be private from a portrait that, thinking itself alone, mutters history to itself. Dobby kept working, kept folding gentleness into the corners where cruelty liked to collect, and the syllable he had felt on the newspaper's skin began to sound within him like a question rung lightly on a bell. He did not yet dare to ask it aloud. He had a tray to carry, a draft to still, an hour to set upright, but his quiet rebellions, his secret tailor's work, began to point, not outward, not yet, but upward, like small plants turning their faces toward a sun they cannot see. And the name he had not quite heard yet, the story he had not quite learned, would soon pour itself through the cracks he had made in the house's stern habits, offering him a direction that felt like breath after a long climb in tight corridors. For even a life sown to duty can feel when the thread is about to pass through a different eye. And Dobby, bending over a newly polished shoe that caught the window's pale light like a promise, felt the tug that meant a tale larger than the house was reaching for him. And it is toward that first glimmer, toward the rumor of a boy whose survival changed the weather, that the story now tilts, gently, as if the whole world were a tray being carried carefully from one room to the next. Legends are not always told in loud voices. Sometimes they arrive like drafts under doors, quiet, persistent, reshaping air without needing to be seen. For Dobby, the first whispers of Harry Potter's name came this way. He did not seek them. They found him, carried in the folded corners of discarded newspapers, left too close to the fire, in the murmurs of portraits, whose painted ears had heard more than they pretended, in the unfinished sentences of guests who leaned too far back in dining chairs, polished to a mirror. The boy who had survived, the boy who lived. These words were not meant for elves, but walls are generous gossips. And Dobby, listening in the careful silence of duty, received. At first, the name was only a curiosity. To Dobby, the child in another house was as distant as a star pinned to the ceiling tapestry of the drawing room. Yet the way the name was spoken, half awe, half bitterness, gave it weight. Wizards, who usually spoke of themselves as inevitable, used Harry Potter's name as if it were a stone in their shoe, something small that had altered their stride. For an elf trained to read every twitch of a master's eyebrow, every shift in tone, this was knowledge enough. Here was a child whose mere being could cause discomfort to those who believed themselves beyond disturbance. The elders noticed Dobby's listening, though they never scolded. Nix, wrapping a tray in linen, once muttered, "Some names are lanterns. Don't look too long, or you'll see all the moths they draw." Hella, binding herbs with string, hummed under her breath, a tune that placed Harry's name among its notes, though she would never admit to singing it. Even Tib, who usually spoke only of floors and fires, said once, "Hope is heavier than silver, little one. Best be careful where you set it down." These remarks puzzled Dobby, but they also began to build a shape in his mind, like a room being furnished piece by piece. When Master and Mistress spoke of Harry Potter, it was never as a child. It was as a symbol, an inconvenience, a question mark scrawled across their certainty. Dobby learned, from the gaps in their sentences, that this boy had undone something great and terrible, that his continued existence was an insult to those who had considered themselves invincible. Dobby had no picture of Harry then, No sound of his voice, no memory to hold, but he had the way a goblet trembled faintly when the master pronounced the name, the way the mistress's fingers tightened on her pearls, the way the young master sneered as though envy were already a taste. He knew too well. In these details, Dobby stitched together a present. He began to imagine Harry as a sort of opposite to the house in which he lived. If these walls were full of portraits that shouted about blood and destiny, perhaps Harry lived in a place with no portraits at all, or ones that laughed instead of sneered. If the mistress's commands fell like frost, perhaps Harry's words fell like rain, softening earth instead of hardening it. If punishments here were strict and self-inflicted, perhaps Harry was allowed mistakes that ended only in learning. Dobby could not know if these thoughts were true, but imagination, once woken, refuses to return to bed. He carried this secret imagining like a candle cupped in his hands. When he polished boots until he could see his own bent reflection in the leather, he whispered, "The boy who lived walks somewhere with shoes that choose their shine." When he brushed soot from the grate, he thought, "The boy who lived does not sit by such fires." When he pressed his forehead to the floor in penance for a task gone imperfect, he thought, "The boy who lived may never bow, except perhaps in kindness." Each thought was a spark that did not burn him. It warmed. Yet sparks are dangerous in houses lined with old curtains and stricter traditions. Dobby hid his thoughts, practicing invisibility even in his own chest. Still, they glimmered. When the young master spoke cruelly of classmates, Dobby softened a starch in his collars so that arrogance would wrinkle a little faster. When the mistress gave an order meant to display power rather than necessity, Dobby carried it out with such speed that it robbed the command of its savour. These were small rebellions, unnoticed, but each one fueled by the quiet picture of a boy who lived somewhere beyond. At night, when the manor slept, Dobby lay awake. Elves do not dream, as wizards do, but they drift through memories sharpened by magic. Dobby's drift was always interrupted by that syllable, Harry. It rang against his bones, like a spoon struck on glass. He wondered if the boy ever heard his own name, so often, or if it moved around him like an invisible cloak. He wondered if Harry, wherever he was, felt the weight of the hopes that clung to him. He wondered if Harry would be kind, should they ever meet. And though he punished himself for presumption, Dobby began to hope that there might exist somewhere, someone who could bend the chains that tradition had clasped so tightly around elves. Not for himself alone. Dobby was small, and smallness seemed natural, but for the idea that service could mean love freely given, not obedience nailed into the skin. Hope that a name could be more than a lantern drawing moths, more than a stone in a shoe, but a door, one that even a house elf might one day step through. The candle of that hope flickered, fragile, but it never went out. And in the years to come, when chance and courage drew Dobby's path closer to the boy whose name had haunted the corridors, that small flame would guide him, would keep him steady, even when fear blew hardest, even when punishment sought to snuff it out. For now, he held it secret, a hidden ember in the hearth of his heart, warming him as he bent to his endless tasks and listened for the sound of a world beyond the manor walls. And it is to that ember, the first shy stirring of belief that destiny might touch even a house elf's life, that our story now turns, carrying us closer to the day when Dobby's hidden hope would find its first true breath. Hope, once planted, grows even in poor soil, stretching tender roots into cracks and drinking from the smallest trickles of kindness. For Dobby, that spark of hope he held for the boy who lived began to deepen, turning into something sturdier, though he barely understood it himself. The Malfoy household was no place for such secret growth, yet even there, in the shadow of arrogance and cruelty, Dobby found ways to water his fragile faith. The tasks never lessened. Day after day, his hands were raw from scrubbing cauldrons until they gleamed, his back stiff from bowing to bells rung more often to remind him of his place than to call him to actual service. His punishments too increased, for the masters of that house delighted in fault-finding. A wrinkle left in a sheet, a spoon not aligned with military precision, dust on the spine of a book. No one would read. Any of these could earn a harsh word or a command that drove him to self-punishment. Dobby endured each with the ritual exactness that had been bred into his kind, but behind every flinch and bow, a new awareness stirred. Perhaps the harshness was not justice. Perhaps it was cruelty pretending to be necessity. He began to practice small kindnesses in secret, as if rehearsing for another world, when a mouse darted across the kitchen and the mistress demanded it be destroyed. Dobby caught it gently, slipped it into a pocket of cloth, and carried it to the hedgerows outside. When the young master sneered at the gardeners for their slow work, Dobby whispered charms into the soil, so that the earth gave up weeds more easily to the tired men's hands. These were rebellions, so slight that they left no mark on the household's pride, yet they left marks in Dobby's own heart, teaching him that service could also mean mercy. And all the while, the name of Harry Potter grew louder in the world above him. Wizards who came to dine spoke of him in hushed voices, sometimes with awe, sometimes with bitterness. They called him the one who ended the Dark Lord. Though Dobby never heard exactly how, they called him the boy who escaped, as if survival itself were a crime against power. They called him a danger to tradition, which made Dobby's ears prickle, for tradition in that house often felt like a chain disguised as velvet. Dobby pieced together these fragments until the picture in his mind grew clearer. Harry Potter was not simply a child. He was a contradiction, a living question mark in a world that hated to be questioned. On certain nights, when the manor's windows glowed like stern eyes against the dark, Dobby crept to the kitchens alone and sat with his back against the stove, the coals fading to red whispers. He would whisper too, though only to himself. If he can live, perhaps I can hope. He did not dare speak the boy's name aloud. Names have power, and an elf's whisper might travel where it should not. But he carried the syllables silently, tasting them like honey stolen from a spoon. The elders sometimes watched him with eyes that had grown dim from decades of duty. Tib shook his head once and muttered, "Careful, lad. Hope bends the back worse than chains." Pella only smiled faintly, as though she remembered a time when she too had believed in something beyond obedience. Nick said nothing at all, but once left a crust of bread beside Dobby's corner of the hearth without explanation. That, to Dobby, was answer enough. Even in silence, kindness survives. Yet kindness, for an elf bound to cruel masters, always carried danger. The young master, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, began to notice when punishments did not cut as deep as they should. When Dobby's submission had the faintest delay, a frown here, a snapped order there, signs that suspicion had begun, Dobby masked his thoughts more carefully, punishing himself twice for every slip, until his skin bore the map of invisible lashes. But beneath the sting he held to the ember inside him. Every mark was a reminder. If cruelty could wound, then kindness could heal. If obedience could break him, then hope could mend him. The turning came not with a shout, but with a whisper, as most true turnings do. A guest at supper, speaking too freely after wine, muttered that the boy Harry would soon return to Hogwarts for a second year, that he was in danger. That dark plots circled him already. Dobby, carrying in a platter of sugared figs, nearly dropped the tray. Danger. The word rang louder than chains. It was one thing to hold hope in secret. It was another to hear that the one who bore it might be threatened. That night, when the household slept, Dobby sat awake, his hands trembling in his lap, and for the first time, he felt something stronger than obedience stirring in him, a need to act. What could an elf do? His life was bound, his voice ignored, his punishment certain, yet Dobby's heart whispered that perhaps his hands, trained in tasks, might shape something more than polished silver, that perhaps his voice, trained in silence, might one day speak where silence had failed. The thought frightened him, and he punished himself with blows against the stone floor until his ears rang. Still, when he lay down aching, the ember within him glowed fiercer than ever. And so the days turned, the tasks repeated, the punishments returned, but Dobby carried within him a secret weight, a choice not yet made, a rebellion not yet begun. Each polished goblet, each folded towel, each whispered kindness to a mouse or a weed, became rehearsal for the day when he would dare something larger. The boy who lived had never met him, never spoken his name, but already Dobby's life was bending toward him like a plant straining for unseen sunlight. And as the summer deepened and the manor filled with darker talk, the air itself seemed to prepare for change, for a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Dobby listened, trembling but unyielding, for he knew the time was near when hope would have to leave the safety of silence and step, barefoot, and shaking into the world. The summer air in the Malfoy Manor grew thick, not only with heat, but with whispers. Guests came more often, voices low and urgent, laughter brittle as glass. They spoke of Hogwarts, of politics, of darkening things. Dobby bent at his work polishing goblets until he could see his anxious eyes in their curved silver, caught fragments that chilled him more than the stone floors ever had. Plans, plots, dangers woven in the shadows, and always Harry Potter's name at the centre, as though the boy were a flame drawing moths and hawks alike. The ember of hope inside Dobby flared into something sharper. Fear, hope alone. He could cradle in secret, a comfort against the cold of cruelty. But fear made his small hands tremble, made his ears twitch at every mention, made him understand that silence might not be enough. If Harry Potter was in danger, if those who hated his very survival were planning, then to do nothing would be to watch the last light go out. And Dobby, though he was bound by magic and chains of tradition, found that he could not sit quietly while danger crept toward the boy who lived. His first thought was letters. Wizards wrote them always, folded them into envelopes like secrets pressed into shells. Dobby watched as owls swept through the manor windows, carrying news to places he had never seen. If he could only take a letter, he thought, carry it away, hide it. Perhaps Harry Potter would be warned. But how could a house elf bound to obedience steal from the very family that commanded him? The thought alone sent pain shooting through his bones. Punishment rising like storm water, he gasped, falling to the flagstones, curling in on himself as the magic of his binding lashed him for daring to imagine disobedience. Still, even in the pain, his mind whispered, perhaps there is another way. And so he waited, listening for opportunity. It came in a careless moment, as they often do. The mistress, busy scolding a servant for a crease in the draperies, tossed aside a stack of envelopes. Letters bound for posting later. Dobby, trembling, slipped one beneath his cloth. As he bowed, he carried it away, not to deliver it, but to hide it. Each step felt like thunder in his chest, each breath like a betrayal. Yet he did it, tucking the letter behind a loose stone in the scullery wall. His heart pounded with terror, but also with something new, defiance. The punishment came swiftly. He had not even finished stacking kindling before the magic found him. His ears rang, his limbs shook, as invisible chains twisted. Dobby bit down on his cries, for an elf does not scream in the hearing of masters. But as he lay afterward, bruised in body and spirit, he felt the ember inside him glow steadier. If such pain was the cost of protecting Harry Potter, then Dobby would pay it again. He grew bolder. When more letters came, he found excuses to linger, to gather them in his arms, to shuffle them clumsily until one slipped away. Each stolen letter hid in the scullery wall, unseen, unread, but safe from reaching its destination. They bore news of Harry Potter's friends, invitations, reassurances, words that would have eased his loneliness. Dobby wept to keep them from him, yet he knew it was the only way, for the letters were not merely ink and parchment, they were lures. The masters of the house wanted Harry to feel abandoned, wanted him to step alone into danger. Dobby, desperate and small, tried to protect him the only way he could, by ensuring those letters never arrived. At night, when the house was quiet, Dobby would creep to the hidden stack and trace the envelopes with trembling fingers. He imagined the boy who lived, sitting somewhere far away, wondering why no word came. His heart ached at the thought of Harry's confusion, his hurt. "Forgive Dobby," he whispered into the dark, "for Dobby is cruel only to be kind." Each word was a prayer and a plea, carried on the dust of the scullery. The other elves watched in silence. Pella once caught him slipping an envelope into the wall and said nothing, only touched his shoulder with a hand, soft as cloth. Tabe muttered that meddling with wizard letters was a dangerous game, but his voice held no rebuke, only weary fear. Nix, who had always been quiet, pressed a crust of bread into Dobby's hand one morning, as if to say, "Survive, if nothing else." These small gestures were their approval, though none dared speak it aloud. But still, the fear pressed heavier. The master's talk grew sharper, and Dobby's heart told him that letters alone would not save Harry Potter. He would have to do more, something greater, something bolder than any elf had dared, and though the thought filled him with dread, It also filled him with a strange exhilaration, as if chains that had always been invisible were beginning, just slightly, to loosen. And so, trembling yet resolute, Dobby began to plan, for the boy he had never met, for the boy who carried the hopes of a world that did not even see him. He would risk punishment, risk discovery, risk everything. A house elf's life was service, yes, but Dobby was beginning to believe it could also be choice. There is a particular courage that belongs to the very small, a bravery that does not trumpet itself, but moves like a shadow across a bright floor. Determined, tender, and a little trembling, Dobby carried that courage with him, as he slipped from the Malfoy Manor into the knitting of night, travelling the way house elves do, between edges, along the hems of things, until the lamps and lawns of wealth gave way to neat hedges, square windows, and the careful privacy of Muggle streets. He had never much liked the silence of such places. It was a different quiet than Kitchen's Keep, a quiet that held its breath as though afraid to be caught. Yet here, tucked into the perfectly ordinary fabric of a perfectly ordinary suburb, lived the boy whose name had turned into a candle inside Dobby's ribs. The house was a box folded out of politeness and paint. Its curtains sat with their backs straight. Its doorbell wore a self-satisfied smile. Inside, voices spoke in the tidy grammar of people who believe they are the center of the sensible world. Dobby stood just beyond the slice of lamplight that fell across the garden path and listened to the room where the boy was kept. Listened not with ears only, but with that finer attention elves learn, the way one listens to dough or to rooms that have been arguing. The air around the boy tasted like secrecy and dust, the flavor of a cupboard that has tried to masquerade as a bedroom. Dobby felt anger's quick heat and drew it back, cradling it for anger as a bad shepherd for choice. He went inside the way elves go, at the moment between a blink and another blink, when the world does not notice if one small thing rearranges itself. He found the boy and saw, with an ache that surprised him, how ordinary Harry's smallness was, how his hair refused to obey, how his eyes carried too much weather for their age, how his shoulders held a readiness to apologize that did not belong on a hero. A surge of tenderness nearly undid Dobby. He had planned words, warnings, strategies, as neat as folded cloth, and now he wanted only to protect, to build a room around this child where danger could not find a door. But there was no time for such wishes. The household was sharpening itself downstairs. Plates were arrayed like polite shields. Cutlery lay to attention. A roast rehearsed, being impressive. Dobby had heard enough at the manor to know what these dinners were for. Alliances disguised as appetizers, ambitions served under sauce. The boy was to be kept out of sight, his magic sealed away from notice. Dobby's warning would have to thread a needle between secrecy and salvation. He must keep Harry from returning to school without harming him. He must stop disaster without revealing himself to those who would turn his existence into a punishment. He did what elves are best at. He listened for the grain of the moment, found a seam, and slid his plan through. The pudding was the moment's heart. It had been all day in the making. Layers stacked with pride, cream persuaded into obedience, chocolate taught to shine like something expensive. It would arrive at the table the way a triumphant sentence arrives at the end of a paragraph. Dobby could not let that sentence land. He needed a spectacle that would not bruise the boy's body, yet would rattle the adults' plans until they fell from their hands. He crept to the kitchen. The pudding stood on its stand like a boast in a party dress. Dobby placed his palms close to it, not touching, and breathed the old coaxing breath that asks magic to behave while doing exactly what it was not meant to do. The cream quivered, listening. He lifted, just a little, and the air thickened under the dessert, as under a small boat. Elves do not need wands to speak to balance. The pudding rose, wobbling with a bravery that belonged to desserts and to house elves, and Dobby walked it, carefully, through the swing of doors, and the startled quiet of adults who can feel something about to go wrong, but have not yet decided whose fault it will be. It is a terrible thing, and sometimes necessary to bring disaster into a room on purpose. Dobby steadied his breath, kept his hands sure, and guided the pudding toward the woman whose voice had been rehearsing amiability like a song learned for show. The moment stretched, time yawned. Someone laughed a fraction too loudly, and Dobby released his small, stubborn hold. Gravity took the gift with delight. Cream collapsed like a sigh that had been holding itself too long. Chocolate met silk with the intimacy of catastrophe. The room gasped as one body, A man cursed and then remembered his manners and swallowed the curse whole. A boy upstairs flinched in a way Dobby felt in his own knees. Then came the letter, as Dobby knew it would. Magic is tidy about rules, untidy in all else perhaps, but punctilious about lines drawn. The ministry's owl battered the air, brisk and lawful, and spilled its paper judgment into the room like ice water. The adult's shock broke apart into accusation, into fury aimed like furniture at the nearest target. The boy's name, a sound the house usually tried not to learn, was spoken again and again in a tone made of blame, wrapped in triumph. You see, the adults seemed to say to one another, this is what such children do, ruin things with their difference. Dobby stood in the draught of their anger and felt it lift the hairs on his arms. He was sorry for the mess. He was a creature of kitchens after all, but he was not sorry for the disruption. There are pains that keep worse pains from entering. He only prayed the boy would read the warning inside the chaos danger coils around Hogwarts. Do not go. Do not go. He whispered it, silently, as if letters could be pushed into Harry's understanding without passing through ears. But warnings, like puddings, do not always land as their maker intends. The boy's face hardening. Yes, Dobby saw that, his jaw setting against the injustice of being blamed, of being caged by rules he did not write. The adults, flushed with the satisfaction of authority displayed, moved quickly to convert punishment into architecture. Bars would soon arrive, bolts, notices written in the ink of grown-up certainty. Dobby's heart climbed and fell, as if it were the one wobbling back to the kitchen on a platter. He had protected the boy from one danger, only to invite another to tighten its rings around him. The frog jump of regret landed in Dobby's throat. He did what he could in the edges that remained. He nudged the owl to be swifter than usual so the room's raving could be edited by shock. He coaxed the chandelier to surrender. Only a single sacrificial drop of wax rather than a rain of it. He slowed the roast smoke, so the fire alarm would not add its shriek to the humiliation. It is a strange craft. The art of delivering a calamity gently, of arranging a fall so it bruises but does not break, of letting a lesson hurt just enough to be learned. The room still shook with outrage, but it did not shatter, and in that narrow mercy Dobby found a little room to breathe. Afterward, when footsteps pounded stairs and locks rehearsed their future places and voices rehearsed their future threats, Dobby slipped back to the boy's door. He risked one more moment, one more plea, his fingers twisting the hem of his rag, as if it could wring courage out of cloth. He spoke softly, pressing each word into the air, like seeds into soil. Danger at school. Do not be brave in the wrong direction. Fear is not always a coward's map. The boy's eyes flashed, not with fear, but with a promise. Dobby recognized. I will not be kept. Ah, child, Dobby thought, both warmed and chilled. You are a different kind of stubborn than this house knows how to hold. The night returned. The house exhaled its scandal in little draughts under doors. Somewhere, a neighbour set down a teacup with the satisfaction of having had their evening confirmed in its suspicions. Dobby left the way he had come, along edges. In the hedges, dew rehearsed being pearls. A cat inspected the universe, and found it still adequately mysterious. The stars, those old and patient witnesses, looked down at a street where a boy had just become more trapped in order to remain more himself. The journey back to the manor felt longer, though elves travel the same distance the same way, regardless of sorrow. He arrived to a house that could smell deviation the way thunder smells rain. There are punishments a house imagines, because it has been taught to. There are punishments a master imagines, because he has learned to enjoy the shape of regret on another's face. There are punishments an elf imagines for himself because he is determined to remain exact. Dobby stood very straight and very small, and let the future step into the room, lay out its instruments, and clear its throat. For every act of rebellion has its echo, and the echo was waiting for him in the cold corridors he knew too well, and it is down those corridors, toward the billowed shadow of Malfoy punishment, that our quiet tread now turns, carrying with it Cream's sweet ghost, a boy's burning look, and the stubborn ember of an elf who has chosen finally to choose. Punishments in the Malfoy household were never quiet things. They were not simple corrections of mistake, but grand performances of power, sharpened to remind both servant and master of the chains that bound them together. For Dobby, whose rebellions had grown braver with each hidden letter, with each whisper of warning. The punishment that followed the Privet Drive incident was heavier than any he had known before. He was summoned at once to the drawing room, the chamber that never welcomed warmth. Its windows were high and thin, its curtains drawn to keep out the softness of moonlight, its air cold. Despite the summer outside, the young master lounged with a predator's smile, his pale eyes gleaming as if he had scented prey. Beside him, the mistress sat rigid as a blade, her voice like a hiss of parchment tearing. They did not need to raise their voices. The walls themselves seemed to lean in, hungry for cruelty. Dobby bowed low, his ears brushing the floor, trembling so hard that the candle flames shivered with him. The accusations came in slivers, sharp and mocking. A pudding fallen where it should not. A ministry owl swooping with laws in its beak. A boy's name, spoken with disdain, turned suddenly into a weapon. Potter, the young master spat, drawing out the syllables as if it tasted foul. Always Potter. Dobby's ears burned. He dared not look up, dared not speak, but his silence was answer enough, and it sealed his fate. The order came swift. Punish yourself. Elves were expected to be their own executioners, to carry out the sentence before their master's eyes. Dobby obeyed, because to refuse would have been a betrayal too loud to survive. He beat his head against the polished floor until the world rang with bells of pain. He ironed his own ears until the smell of scorched flesh filled the air. He dragged the poker from the fire across his thin arms, leaving welts like dark signatures, and all the while the Malfoys watched, sipping their wine, speaking idly of their guests, as though Dobby's agony were no more than background music to their evening. But pain is a strange teacher. It sharpens, but it also clarifies. Each lash of suffering struck a chord inside Dobby, not of submission, but of resolve. For with every blow he delivered to himself, he whispered inwardly the same refrain: Harry Potter must be warned. Harry Potter must be saved. The punishments became not just penance, but fuel, hammering into him the certainty that his rebellion was right. When at last they dismissed him, broken and staggering, Dobby retreated to the kitchen hearth, curling small as a cinder. His body shook, but his spirit did not bend. The faces of Tidpella and Nyx hovered in memory, but they could not help him now. He alone bore the weight of this dangerous hope. He licked his wounds with the silence of the enslaved, but inside, the ember glowed brighter. He would not stop. He could not stop. And so, the days crawled forward. Tasks filled his hours, polishing, scrubbing, bowing, fetching, each one done with aching limbs, with the ghost of pain still simmering in his skin, yet behind every bow, every scrape, Dobby carried his secret plan. He would return. He would find the boy again. The first warning had ended in disaster. But warnings are seeds, and seeds must be sown more than once before they take root. The young master's laughter rang in his ears, cruel and careless. The mistress's orders weighed like stones. Yet Dobby clutched the thought that made even punishment bearable. He had acted. He had defied. And though the cost was high, the boy he had never met was one step closer to being saved. That belief was the salve upon his wounds, the cloth that wrapped his burns, the whisper that carried him into uneasy sleep. For though Dobby's body bore the marks of punishment, his heart bore something stronger still, defiance now etched into him as deeply as pain. And as the summer waned, and the air of the manor thickened with darker plots, he knew with terrible certainty that the worst was yet to come, which meant that his courage too would have to grow. The days after punishment stretched like iron chains, heavy and clinking with every movement. Yet in the quiet folds of his suffering, Dobby felt something stirring, something planted in him by the sight of Harry's face at Privet Drive. That face, startled but brave, carried no malice, no disdain. It had looked at him not as one looks at a tool, but as one looks at a creature with a voice. That single glance, fleeting as it was, had seeded in Dobby a new truth. Compassion exists, even for house elves. In the Malfoy household, compassion was rare as rain in drought. The masters viewed elves as furniture with hands, as shadows that could be ordered about. If an elf was noticed, it was only to be punished. But Harry Potter, he had spoken to Dobby with concern, had asked why, had tried to understand. That was dangerous. Yes, but it was also intoxicating. For the first time in all his years of servitude, Dobby had felt the warmth of recognition. He clung to that moment as he resumed his endless labours. Every polished boot, every scrubbed stair, every folded robe was accompanied by the echo of Harry's voice. "Why are you doing this?" Words simple yet heavy as stone. They turned over and over in Dobby's mind. Why indeed? Why did elves obey until their skin blistered, their bones ached, their hearts shriveled? Tradition answered, because it had always been so. Fear answered, because punishment waited otherwise. But compassion whispered a new answer. Perhaps it need not be so forever. The manor walls seemed to hear his thoughts. Their shadows lengthened, suspicious. The young master's gaze lingered longer upon him, as though sensing a shift. The mistress tightened her commands, words brittle as glass, and the master, oh, the master. He sat in the drawing room, his long fingers tapping against the arm of his chair, a rhythm of power too steady to be casual. Dobby felt watched, weighed, measured for cracks. Yet even as suspicion thickened, the ember of Harry's kindness refused to dim. At night, while the house slumbered and the portraits muttered among themselves, Dobby would sit by the scullery wall where he had hidden the stolen letters. He traced their edges with trembling fingers, imagining Harry's hands opening them, Harry's eyes brightening at his friend's words. Guilt stabbed him, for he was the thief who had kept those comforts away. But alongside guilt bloomed resolve. Better loneliness than death. Better Harry think himself forgotten than find himself destroyed. Still, the thought gnawed at him. What if Harry mistook silence for abandonment? What if despair led him into recklessness? Dobby's small chest ached with worry, to protect someone without their knowing. It was a cruel kindness, one that left Dobby torn between duty and the desperate need to reveal himself. And yet he could not stop thinking of those green eyes, sharp and alive, looking straight into his own. It was in that gaze, in that fleeting connection, that Dobby began to feel something he had never allowed himself before, the faint, trembling outline of freedom. Not freedom given by a master, nor freedom earned through death, but freedom chosen, a freedom that lived in the heart. Even if the body still bowed, Harry's compassion had unlocked that door, even if neither of them yet understood it. From then on, every act of service Dobby performed carried two meanings. To the Malfoys, he was obedient, precise, invisible. But to himself, each bow was a disguise, each task a rehearsal for rebellion. The scrubbed floors whispered resistance. The polished silver shone with defiance. Even his punishments became fuel. Every welt, every burn, every bruise was proof that he had not yielded his ember. He suffered, yes, but he suffered with purpose. And so the seed of freedom grew quietly within him, watered by Harry's kindness, shielded by Dobby's own stubborn hope. One day, he thought, the chains might fall. One day the word master might mean respect freely given, not fear enforced. One day house elves might be seen not as shadows, but as selves. For now, that dream was too dangerous to speak aloud. But Dobby carried it close as a heartbeat. The boy who lived did not know it yet, but he had already saved someone, not from basilisk or dark lord, but from despair. He had saved a house elf from believing that cruelty was the only law, and for that gift, Dobby's loyalty grew roots so deep that no punishment, no spell, no command could ever wrench it free. And it is with that root, unseen but alive, that we follow Dobby into the gathering dark. For the world was turning toward Hogwarts again, and danger there waited like a snake coiled in stone. Morning gathered itself into trains, their long iron lungs breathing steam like tame dragons, and London Station shook its old bones and remembered how to sing. The clocks kept their proud, clipped music, and families threaded themselves between trunks and owls, and the excited panic of too many goodbyes. Dobby stood where house elves stand best, between things, half in shadow, half in a draft, small as a comma, in a sentence the world believed it had already finished. He had come not to be seen, not to be thanked, but to turn a key in a lock that should never have been there, to keep a boy from walking straight into a coil of danger that had already begun to tighten. He had thought 1,000 thoughts in the nights, since Privet Drive, each one a little light that tried to show him a kinder path. He had searched for warnings that would not wound, for barriers that would not break hearts, but the summer talk at the manor had grown darker and narrower, like a corridor that leads to a room with no windows, and Dobby felt the weight of something that hunted by whispers. If he goes back, he will be hurt. The sentence sat inside him like a stone. He could not move it. He could only choose how to carry it. The barrier between Muggle platform and Wizarding platform looked like any other section of brick, modest and certain of itself, a clever hinge between ordinary and elsewhere. To most eyes it was a kindness, a secret door for excited children and weary parents, for luggage that liked to rattle itself and cats that preferred conversation to mewing. To Dobby, it was a throat that swallowed futures. He pressed his small palm to the cool brick and felt the old charms humming, a song of welcome that had greeted generations. He listened, and underneath the welcome he heard what elves hear, that wizards often forget, the slight give in any spell, the seam that if coaxed will fold. He did not come to break. He came to pause. Elf magic, nimble and sideways, slipped into the weave as a new thread, polite as a guest, and stubborn as ivy. He whispered the hush that house elves use for kettles that want to boil too fast, for rooms that want to argue, for doors that should wait just one breath longer before opening. The bricks agreed to remember being bricks a little more firmly than usual. The archway, usually generous, pursed its lips and decided for once to be shy. Dobby stepped back into the press of travellers, heart fluttering like a trapped sparrow, and waited for the boy whose name had taught him what hope felt like. Harry came with a friend, who glowed with the sort of certainty that only very good families and very loving mothers give to sons. Their trolley rattled a happy rhythm. The owl blinked a skeptical blessing on everything. Dobby's hands clenched in his rag. He had rehearsed Harry's stride in memory. Quick, decisive, kind even to the floor, and now it came true before him. And for a moment he nearly undid all his careful work. To see the boy alive was already to want him happy. But living is a longer word than happy. Dobby clung to that. They ran. That is how children accept magic. Headlong, with a trust that flings itself like a stone into a lake. The cart took the air. The bricks should have melted to let them through, and did not. Sound jumped. Metal clanged. The station sucked in a collective breath. The boys stumbled back, bruised less in body than in belief, and stood blinking at the wall that had briefly misremembered its purpose. Dobby's whole small self ached at the sight, at the confusion that dimmed Harry's face, at the way the friend's voice turned quick, with problem-solving, while Harry's eyes flickered, just once, toward the place where the platform should be, as if calling it back by wanting alone. The crowd folded around the moment the way a sea folds around a rock. A guard looked irritated without quite knowing why. A woman with too many bags tutted on principle. Dobby cradled his breathing so tightly it almost broke. He had made the world stutter, and now he must hold it that way just long enough to persuade fate to choose a different road. The charm tugged at his strength. Elf magic is efficient but honest about cost. He felt it in his elbows, in that soft triangle where neck becomes shoulder, in the little bones of his feet. A little longer, he told the bricks. For love's sake, only a little longer. The boys tried again, caution turning the run into a measured push. Again the wall honoured its newfound shyness. The clock heaved its hands forward. Whistles argued. Dobby counted heartbeats. Not numbers, but names. Tib, Pella, Nix, steadying himself with remembered kindness. Forgive Dobby, he whispered to the air round Harry, for hurting the day to save the year. At last, the station's tide began to turn. Wizards vanish with the neatness of people practiced at secrets. The bricks, relieved of their most joyful work, grew smug again. Dobby, shaking a little now, loosened the hush he had braided into the arch. It would be needed again, but not today. He had done enough, too much. He wanted only to see the boys give up and go home, to be safe and sullen under the weight of an ordinary mistake. Safety is often indistinguishable from disappointment when one is young, but youth is inventive and stubborn in a way that frightens and delights the gods. The boys did not go home. They looked at each other with the bright, terrible logic of 12-year-olds who have already met trouble and found it an interesting conversationalist. Dobby felt rather than saw the decision. Felt it in the tilt of Harry's chin, in the friend's grin that had a little dare tucked in the corner. The car that should have been only car uncloaked its second life. Wheels that should have remained loyal to roads remembered sky. Magic laughed somewhere, and Dobby's charm, simple, careful, almost gentle by comparison, felt suddenly like the smallest stick against a river in spate. He tried, in that last moment before flight, to wrap the air around them with caution, the way a mother wraps a scarf. He whispered balance to axles, patience to wings that were not wings, a plea to the fall to be merciful when it came. He could not stop them, not without ripping the day in ways that would cut the boy as well. He watched them soar untidily into the morning, 2 points of brave foolishness stitching a line across the city's blue. For a heartbeat, joy punched him. Harry would not be stopped. He would not be broken. He would not learn obedience at a wall. And then fear untied that joy and let it fall. The sky is kind, until it is not. The platform exhaled its secret back into brick. Dobby, suddenly small in a world that had become too large, sagged behind a pillar. He had meant to save the boy from the door that opened into danger. Instead, he had nudged him toward a window with thinner glass. Elves are poor at guessing the futures of heroes, he thought, and the thought did not comfort him. He went back the way he had come, between, and the manor received him with its usual temperature, cold as a well, indifferent as marble. In its corridors, news travelled quickly without seeming to move at all. A car had been seen. A school had been reached. Punishments would be sharpened, of course. Someone would be made to understand that invisible things still cast shadows that can be measured. Dobby kept his eyes to the grain of the floor and counted his steps in the old way, giving each one a little job. Carry pain, carry worry, carry on. When he reached the sanctuary of the scullery, he let himself be tired. Fatigue in an elf is a private language. It says you are still here. The work remains. So does the love that binds you to it. He set a kettle to thinking about boiling and leaned his head against the cool, sensible wall where letters once hid and choices were born. He had failed and succeeded in the same hour, kept Harry from the safe door, watched him choose the dangerous sky, and he did not know what arithmetic to use for such sums. Still, in the clatter of pots settling and the old stove ticking itself calm, Dobby found a small, stubborn comfort. He had not been the only will in the story. The boy had chosen, and choice, though it leads into storms, is the seed of every freedom Dobby could imagine. The sky had frightened him. It had also sung. Perhaps, he thought, the song would carry Harry safely over what waited in stone. Perhaps. And as he lifted the kettle just before it burst into its impatient song, as if relieving it of a too harsh duty, Dobby felt the house turn its attention toward him, toward the scent of rebellion on his rag, and he knew the reckoning would come, sharper, longer, more inventive than before. And so we go with him now, into that tightening corridor, where pain keeps score, and courage learns how to count without using numbers at all, very quietly, very carefully, as though the next breath might also need to be smuggled into being. The manor grew darker after the barrier incident. Shadows seemed to follow Dobby more closely than before, as if the house itself had marked him for suspicion. Whispers chased him through the corridors, threads of rumour that tightened into ropes of punishment. The young master smirked with sharper teeth. The mistress spoke with venom drawn out like a needle. Their displeasure was not only for the pudding disaster, but for the shame of the platform's failure, a disruption too peculiar to ignore. And in the Malfoy household, peculiarities never went unpunished. Dobby was summoned to the drawing room once again, where portraits of pale ancestors glared down with judgment as merciless as spells. The air smelled of polish and iron, the kind of scent that clings to cruelty well practiced. "You meddled," the mistress hissed, her eyes narrow as slits. "You tampered with the wards. Did you think us blind?" The accusation needed no proof. In Malfoy Manor, suspicion was enough. The command was cold. Punish yourself harder this time. And so Dobby obeyed, not because he wished it, but because obedience was a wall too high to climb. The crack of his own hand across his face echoed like a whip. He slammed his head against the marble hearth until dizziness blurred his sight. He pressed hot irons against his wrists. The hiss of flesh sharp in the silence. Each punishment felt like falling into a pit with no bottom, and yet through the pain, a strange clarity rose. Even this, even the cruelty meant to break him, could not smother the ember of his resolve. If the Malfoys feared he had tampered with the platform, then perhaps they already knew Dobby was not fully theirs any longer. In the days that followed, tasks multiplied. He was made to clean rooms that had not been touched in decades. Polished relics layered with curses that hummed beneath his fingers. Scrubbed floors until his small body ached, as if stretched on a rack. Yet the labor was not only punishment, it was distraction, a tactic to grind down his thoughts. But Dobby's mind could not be ground smooth. Between each command, between each bow, he kept thinking of Harry Potter, of the boy's startled compassion at Privet Drive, of the reckless, impossible flight in the enchanted car, of the stubborn way he pressed forward despite every obstacle. Dobby thought, this is why he must live, because he does not bend. Nights were the hardest. The manor's silence was vast, broken only by the rustle of unseen things in the walls. Dobby lay curled in his cupboard corner, skin smarting from the day's ordeals. He would trace letters in the dust with his finger, letters he had stolen, letters never delivered. The names on them became prayers, whispered into the dark. Harry, Ron, Hermione, each name a thread, binding Dobby's pain to a purpose larger than himself. The Malfoy's suspicion did not fade. Lucius Malfoy, with his serpent's calm, questioned him directly. You dare meddle in affairs above you, elf? His cane struck the floor with a sound like a sealed coffin. Dobby shook, but within his trembling was a hidden defiance. He could not confess, yet neither could he repent. Instead he bent low, ears dragging the ground, and whispered apologies that were not apologies at all. For his heart, though bowed, was not theirs. What made the punishments truly dangerous was not their pain, but their relentlessness. They came in waves, leaving no time to heal, no space to dream. And yet in those rare moments when he was left alone, Dobby would clutch at his ragged pillow and let his thoughts fly outward. He imagined Harry laughing freely at Hogwarts, imagined the warmth of friends around him, imagined corridors safe from serpents and shadows. These dreams were fragile, yet stronger than iron, for they gave him something the Malfoys could never command: hope. The weeks bled together, each one heavier than the last. But even as Dobby's body bore the scars of his master's wrath, his spirit carried something else, an unyielding thread that tied him to the boy who had looked at him with kindness. Every punishment only carved the truth deeper. Harry Potter must be protected, no matter the cost. Pain was the price, and Dobby would pay it. Again and again, if only it meant the boy might live. And so the story moved forward, toward the dark heart of the chamber, where serpents stirred and whispers grew louder, and where Dobby's courage would be tested in ways even he could not yet imagine. The castle of Hogwarts, far away from Malfoy Manor, was beginning to tremble with a fear that slithered through its stones. Doors whispered to one another in the evenings. Portraits grew tight-lipped in their frames, and even the staircase hesitated before moving, as though worried about where they might carry a child. Rumors crept faster than footsteps, students stiff as statues, voices echoing from chambers no one dared to enter, eyes wide and unseeing as though they had looked too deeply into darkness. A monster was loose in the school, so said the whispers, and Dobby, far away in the kitchens of cruelty, felt the truth vibrating in the very air he breathed. House elves have ways of hearing what others do not. Magic speaks to them in its undercurrents, in the tremble of wards, in the restless sigh of walls. Dobby felt the serpent stirring long before its name was spoken aloud. The Chamber of Secrets. Those words alone were enough to make his small body shiver. He had heard the stories when he was younger, muttered by elders while polishing copper pans, of Salazar Slytherin's hidden room, of a monster kept waiting for centuries, of a time when the school would be purged of those it deemed unworthy. To the Malfoys, these tales were not horror, but hope. Dobby had listened in silence as his masters laughed, speaking of cleansing, of heritage. Each word had been a stone added to the weight already on his shoulders. And now, it seemed, the old stories had woken. The news reached Malfoy Manor quickly. Lucius Malfoy's lips curled with satisfaction when the whispers arrived on owl wings, telling of petrified students, of panic in the halls. At last, he murmured, stroking the head of his serpent-headed cane. The mistress's eyes gleamed with cruel pride. Even the young master smirked, imagining glory and fear. To them, this was victory unfolding, their ideology seeping into the very stones of Hogwarts. But to Dobby, it was catastrophe, for the boy who lived was once again at the heart of danger. He tried, in every way his small life allowed, to intervene. Each punishment he endured seemed to sharpen his resolve rather than dull it. In secret, While scrubbing flagstones until his fingers bled, he whispered charms toward the castle, small threads of magic meant to cushion, to delay, to protect. He could not battle a basilisk, no elf could, but he could nudge fate ever so slightly to give Harry Potter a fraction more time. A stare that paused a second too long might allow a child to escape. A door that refused to open until the danger had slithered past might save a breath. These were not victories that could be measured, but they were Dobby's offerings, hidden prayers woven into Hogwarts itself. Still, fear gnawed at him. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw green scales sliding across stone, heard fangs striking with venom that could fell any creature at a glance. He imagined Harry's small figure facing such a monster, wand trembling, eyes too young for such terror, and worse, he knew that behind the serpent was a mind, a plan, that Harry could not yet fathom. The diary, though Dobby did not know its true shape, pulsed like a dark heartbeat in the threads of magic he could feel from afar. The Malfoys revelled in every new whisper. Another petrified, they murmured, with glee, as though speaking of trophies rather than children. Dobby bowed his head, silent, his rag clutched tight to keep his trembling hands from betraying him. Inside, he burned. He burned with helplessness, with fear, with a love that no command could erase. He had promised himself that Harry Potter must be saved, and now that promise pressed heavier with every passing day. The elders in the kitchens, Tib and Pella and Nix, saw the change in him. "You carry too much," Pella whispered once, as she passed him a crust of bread. "Elves are not meant to bear the weight of prophecies." Tib muttered that snakes and secrets were wizard problems, not elf problems, but Nix, always the quietest, only touched Dobby's arm and shook his head, as though to say, sometimes wizard problems become everyone's problems, and Dobby knew it was true. The basilisk did not choose its victims by a family name alone. Children, innocent children, were being struck down, and Harry stood in the serpent's path. Nights became unbearable. The manor's walls seemed to hum with the snake's distant song, vibrating through Dobby's bones. He would curl beneath the kitchen table, pressing his ears shut, whispering, "Not him, not Harry, not the boy who is kind." Yet, the fear never left. Even in punishment, when he beat himself raw, when the poker's heat scorched his skin, it was not obedience he thought of. It was Harry's face, pale and startled, staring down a fate he did not yet understand. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened. The monster was hunting. And Dobby, bound and bruised, knew that unless something changed, unless some miracle intervened, the boy he had chosen to protect would not survive. And so the story tightens now, as if the very corridors of Hogwarts were narrowing, carrying us closer and closer to the serpent's hiss, and to the small elf whose love and loyalty would one day turn chains into freedom. Freedom rarely announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it comes folded, humble, tucked inside the smallest kindness, as if it were ashamed of its own brightness. For Dobby, freedom came inside a sock. The basilisk's reign ended with a change in the air that even faraway walls could taste. Panic loosened its fingers. Whispers turned from dread to wonder. A girl restored, a monster slain, a diary destroyed. At Malfoy Manor, the windows did not open to such weather. The master returned furious, sleek with offense, his cane tapping like an accusation that had learned to walk. He moved through the corridors as if the stone itself had disappointed him. Dobby kept to edges, bowing so low the world became alive. There was talk of the headmaster's return, Dumbledore, that old problem, and of a ruined plan whose pages had been written in a young girl's hand. The master's anger was not thunder, but ice, and ice cracked slowly. And all at once, in that crack walked a boy. Harry Potter stood in the marble light of the manor's entrance, small as ever, and somehow tall, dirt and courage still clinging to him like the last hour's rain. Dobby saw him and felt the kettles of his heart begin to sing. He dared not meet the boy's eyes for long, but every glance was a blessing. Alive, alive, alive. Lucius Malfoy's voice slid through the air, pleasant the way poison is pleasant to a wasp. Words only, yet the cane flexed as if anticipating more. There are moments in which a life bends. You do not notice the bending until afterward. During, you are simply breathing through a new shape. Dobby stood near, hands clenched inside his rag, listening to the exchange like a rope. Listens to a knot, The diary, shattered in the chamber, now lay innocently rebuilt by Dumbledore's craft, mute and heavy in its ruined destiny. Harry held it out with a child's open courage and a chess player's hidden thought. "Perhaps you slipped this into a girl's cauldron," the boy said, voice steady, eyes bright with a fierceness that warmed Dobby like a hearth. "Perhaps you want to be more careful where you put your books?" Lucius took the diary with a disdain that curled the lip of the room. He sneered at the boy, he sneered at the world. Sneering was the language he had taught himself to speak. But Harry did not flinch. He reached for a sock, his own, soft and common, patched by days of being true to feet, and tucked it, casual as a miracle, into the hollow of the book. The gesture was so simple, the house barely noticed it. Dobby noticed everything. "Here," said the boy lightly, handing the diary back. "An elf's life is a long education in symbols, rugs, bells, hems. The wrong fold and the right towel, each can carry a sentence if you know how to read. Clothing is not cloth. Clothing is covenant. An elf given clothes is an elf unbound, set loose into the weather of himself." Dobby watched Lucius snatch the diary, careless in contempt, and he felt the world tilt. The sock slipped from paper like an answer from a question. "Master has given Dobby a sock," Dobby breathed, not yet believing the words even as his hands cupped the small gift, as if it might shy away. He stared at the soft, ordinary thing that was suddenly a key, a sky, a door flung open from the inside. The old magic wound around those threads loosened with a sigh, then fell, soundless, like a chain that finally understood its mistake. "Dobby is free." The sentence stood up inside him and grew tall. It filled his lungs until breathing became something new, not obedience inhaled and exhaled, but weather, wide and clean. In that instant, all the punishments, all the careful bows, all the bruises catalogued like house inventory, each fell backward into a room that no longer owned him. He could still walk there in memory. He did not live there anymore. Lucius turned with a rage that wanted a body to inhabit. "You," he began, and the cane in his hand flinched toward the boy like a trained thing, tired of its leash. The old reflex leapt in Dobby to throw himself between, to absorb what was never meant to be his. But freedom moved quicker. It lifted his arm, before fear remembered its script. No wand, no great gesture, only a hand that had learned for years how to set kettles right and settle quarrels between doors and drafts. A push of will, firm as a mother's palm. The force flung the master backward, coat and hair and pride tossed in an untidy arc. The cane clattered, protesting in gilded hiss. "You shall not harm Harry Potter," Dobby said, and his voice, which had been a servant's whisper for so long, surprised itself with how clearly it belonged to him. It is not in an elf's nature to gloat. Victory felt not like triumph, but like balance restored. A tray steadied before the good china could slide. Dobby bowed to the boy, not in servitude but in thanks. An old motion given a new meaning by the light that had just entered it. "Harry Potter freed Dobby," he said, and if the words broke a little, well, so do waves when they find shore. Harry smiled in the way that rescues tired things. "Just Harry," he said, "and maybe be careful, they'll be angry." "Dobby has known anger," the elf murmured, hugging the sock to his chest, as if warmth could be stored there for leaner hours. "Dobby will know the world now." He wanted to say everything, the letters he had hidden, the doorway he had closed, the pudding he had lifted, the prayers he had woven into stones. But bedtime stories know the value of saving some things for later. He simply nodded, a pledge stitched in silence. Where danger finds you, Dobby will not be far behind. Lucius gathered himself with the offended elegance of a man who believes gravity exists to flatter him. He hissed something that made the portraits pretend to sleep. Even anger has to learn new steps when it cannot command. He turned and was gone, taking with him the last claim he imagined he had upon the small figure standing in the marble light. After, the manor's corridors seemed suddenly narrower, as if they sensed an absence they could not replace. Dobby stood in the threshold and listened to the silence. A house makes when a story enters a different room. The sock lay warm against his palm. He could have kissed the floor in thanks to all the small mercies that had led him here. The mice saved, the weeds coaxed, the doors persuaded to wait one breath. Every kindness had been practiced for this moment when he would be kind to himself. He did not run. He walked, small and upright, through halls that had mapped his back for years, past the cupboard where he had learned the names of each board by how it complained, past the scullery wall where letters slept inside dust. He paused there and touched the stone, a farewell to the secrets that had once seemed like courage. "Forgive Dobby," he whispered to the letters that would never be opened. Dobby had to be cruel to be kind. Now Dobby will be kind without cruelty. Outside, the world did an extravagant, ordinary thing. It made wind. Grass bowed to no one in particular. Clouds rehearsed their next shapes. Somewhere a gate clicked because it wished Dobby stepped into this unowned weather, sock against his heart, and learned the first law of freedom. The sky does not ask your name before it looks blue for you. He did not know yet where he would sleep, how he would eat, what work would look like when it was not demanded. He knew only this. A boy had looked at him and seen a self. That vision would be bread enough for one day, and the world would teach him the rest. He lifted his face and let the air write new letters on his skin. Behind him, the manor closed its mouth. Ahead, far beyond hedges and roads, and the stubbornness of old names, lay a castle whose kitchens were warm and whose headmaster smiled as if welcome were a spell that never needed words. Dobby turned his feet in that direction, discovering as he went that steps taken for oneself make a different sound, lighter, braver, like spoons chiming in a drawer when supper is almost ready. And softly, very softly, the story that began with a folded towel and an old pact moved into its next room, where a free elf would learn what choice tastes like, and how wages can sometimes be another word for respect, and how loyalty, when chosen, is the strongest magic of all. The world outside Malfoy Manor had always felt like a dream to Dobby, something glimpsed through cracks and carried in whispers. Now, as he stepped into it for the first time as a free elf, the air tasted different. It was sharp and clean, even when it carried dust, even when it stung with cold. Each breath was no longer borrowed. It was his own. And though his steps faltered at first, as if his legs did not trust the ground without a command to anchor them, soon he realized that every path was open to him. For the first time in his life, no voice snapped from behind to order him where to go. But freedom is not simple, even when wrapped in the softness of a sock. It is both gift and burden, a wide sky that can overwhelm as easily as it liberates. Dobby learned this in his first days away from the Malfoys. He wandered at first, unsure of where to belong. Inns turned him away, some kindly, others with disdain. Wizards stared at him as if he were broken, as if a free elf were a contradiction too troubling to consider. And the house elves he passed in kitchens or markets turned their faces aside, unwilling to meet his eyes, as though his very presence was dangerous. Freedom, he discovered, was as lonely as servitude. Only now the loneliness was unbounded. Still, there were joys woven into the strangeness. He discovered the quiet pleasure of choosing for himself. One night, he decided to sleep on a haystack beneath the stars, simply because he wished to see the moon. Another day, he picked up a crust of bread, not because it was handed to him, but because he hungered and allowed himself to answer that hunger. He even bought a scarf second-hand and ragged, because its color pleased him. Such small things would have seemed meaningless to wizards. But to Dobby, each was a victory, a declaration that he was more than an extension of another's will. The days that followed were not without hardship. Coins were scarce, and Dobby's attempts to barter for food were often met with confusion. Some wizards laughed at the idea of paying a house elf. Others muttered about rebellion and disorder. Yet Dobby persisted. His hands, though small, were skilled, and his magic, humble but precise, was a treasure that could mend torn cloaks, polish tarnished silver, or coax reluctant fires into life. Slowly, by offering his help, not as duty but as choice, he began to gather enough to survive, and with each exchange, he felt a little more certain that he was not an error in the world's design, but part of it. When nights grew long, and his courage wavered, he remembered Harry Potter's eyes, kind, bewildered, determined. That memory was a flame he kept hidden beneath his ribs, one that did not flicker even in the darkest winds. It reminded him that his freedom had not been granted as mockery or accident, but as a gift chosen by someone who saw him as more than property. That thought gave him the strength to press onward when uncertainty gnawed at his spirit. Wandering brought him eventually to the edge of a familiar place, the forest surrounding Hogwarts. Dobby stood at its border, his scarf pulled tight, and felt something deep within him settle. Here, magic did not merely hum, it sang. The castle towers rose like a promise against the sky, and though he dared not step within its gates unbidden, he lingered in the shadows, listening. The laughter of students carried across the grounds, and the scent of feasts drifted on the wind. It was a world of belonging, and for the first time, Dobby wondered if freedom might lead, not to loneliness, but to community. In those quiet evenings by the forest's edge, Dobby began to dream new dreams. He imagined serving not out of fear, but out of joy. He imagined choosing work that honored his hands rather than broke them, and though he did not yet know how, he felt certain that Hogwarts would one day open its doors to him, not as a prisoner, not as a slave, but as an equal guest. The days of wandering were not yet ended, but Dobby's heart carried a map now, one written in kindness, memory, and hope, and that map pointed always toward the castle by the lake, where his true story would begin again. Choice, Dobby soon discovered, was a kind of magic all its own. It shimmered in the smallest moments, in the gentle rebellion of deciding not just how to serve, but whether to serve at all. For an elf whose every breath had once been scripted by another's will, the ability to choose even between crumbs and crusts was intoxicating. He began to collect choices the way other creatures collect treasures. One day he decided to eat slowly, savoring each bite instead of swallowing in haste. Another evening, he chose to sit beside a stream until the stars came, listening to the water talk to itself, knowing no bell would call him away. Once, when he stumbled upon a patch of daisies, he plucked one and tucked it behind his ear, simply because it pleased him. These were not grand decisions, but to Dobby they were miracles, threads of freedom woven into the fabric of his days. The scarf he had bought with his first coin became more than clothing. It became his banner. He wore it proudly, even when wizards sneered, even when other elves glanced away in dismay. To him, the ragged wool was proof that he belonged to himself. He began to notice colors differently, too. Blue, not as the shade of robes polished for a master, but as the wide, forgiving sky. Green, not as the house of Slytherin, but as grass bending to the wind with no command but the sun's. And with every choice, joy grew. Joy in waking when his body wished, not when summoned. Joy in speaking aloud to himself, muttering thoughts that once would have been dangerous. Joy in stretching his fingers across the world as though it were a table set for him as well. Yet freedom was not without its shadows. There were days when loneliness pressed heavy, when the absence of order felt less like liberty and more like emptiness. Sometimes he longed for the simple certainty of command, for the structure of knowing exactly what was required. In those moments, Dobby chastised himself, whispering that freedom must not be wasted with longing for chains. Still, the ache lingered, quiet and persistent. It was then that Dobby discovered the joy of helping for no reason but his own heart's bidding. A farmer's cart stuck in the mud. Dobby steadied the wheels with a spell, a lost owl on its weary flight. He coaxed it toward the north wind, a child crying over a torn toy. He mended it with a flick, leaving before thanks could follow. Each kindness filled the hollow places in him. Each act a reminder that service need not be slavery. When given freely, it was love, and love was the truest kind of magic. The seasons turned. Leaves burned and fell. Snow softened the earth. And still Dobby wandered. He kept close to wizarding places, though he rarely entered them. His heart leaned always toward Hogwarts, where he lingered sometimes on the forest edge, listening to laughter ripple across the lake. He dared not go further. Hogwarts belonged to students, not stray elves, but the sound of joy kept him company, like music drifting from a distant window. And slowly, as the weight of his loneliness eased, Dobby realized something profound. Freedom was not only about being unbound, it was about choosing what to bind yourself to. He did not yet know where his journey would lead, but he began to imagine a life where his work, his care, his loyalty were not demanded but offered. And in that imagining he found a happiness deeper than any he had known before. The days of wandering were shaping him into something new, not merely a free elf, but a self, and the path before him, though uncertain, glowed faintly with promise, as though the world itself were whispering, "Choose, Dobby, choose, and in choosing, become." Freedom, sweet as it was, did not dissolve all doubts. For though Dobby had stepped into a sky that asked him no questions, his heart still wrestled with the oldest one. Who am I, if I am not a servant? He had spent so many years with his identity bound to the Malfoys' cruelty that, when silence greeted him now, he sometimes felt adrift. No bell to answer, no command to obey, no punishment to anticipate. The absence of these things left a hollow space, and in that hollow space, Dobby faced himself. At first, the silence frightened him. He filled it with chores of his own making, mending garments no one had asked him to mend, polishing stones until they gleamed, tidying paths that would be covered again by leaves. It soothed him to work, for work was familiar, and his hands, though free, still remembered the rhythm of labour. But there was no satisfaction in scrubbing a pot when no master waited to scold or to praise. Dobby began to realise that without choice, work was a chain. With choice, it might become art. This realisation came slowly, like dawn through mist. One evening, he built a fire, not for duty but for comfort. He arranged the flames with careful hands until the sparks danced in a way that pleased him. Watching the fire, Dobby felt pride not born of fear, but of creation. The next day, he cooked a meal for himself, seasoning it not with commands but with curiosity, tasting as he went, humming softly. It was clumsy and a little too salty, but it was his. For the first time, Dobby understood that his work could express himself rather than the will of another. Yet even as joy flickered, shame lingered. Other elves, when they caught sight of him, whispered disapprovingly. Clothes, they muttered, as though the sock he wore were a sickness. Their eyes, wide with fear, turned quickly away, as if even to meet his gaze might endanger their bonds. Dobby longed to speak to them, to explain that freedom did not mean betrayal, that kindness need not be commanded, but they would not listen. To them he was broken. To him, they were bound. The space between those truths ached like an old wound. Wizards, too, struggled to understand him. Some laughed at the sight of a free elf, assuming he was mad. Others sneered, saying freedom would only make him lazy, dangerous, ungrateful. Their scorn cut him deeply, for Dobby's heart still longed to be useful, still longed for his care to be welcomed. But here in this new world, usefulness had to be offered, not demanded. And though the change was simple in words, it was vast in feeling. Loneliness stalked him in those days, padding softly behind every step. He thought often of Harry Potter, of the boy whose kindness had shown him a self he had never dared to imagine. Dobby whispered Harry's name like a spell against despair, and in that name found the strength to go on. It was then that Dobby began to keep a little book of choices. Not written in ink, he had no quill, and letters still tangled his eyes, but written in objects. A feather for the day he chose to walk by the river, a pebble for the night he chose to sleep under stars, instead of in a barn, a thread for the scarf he bought. Each token was tucked into a pouch at his side, a growing record of who he was becoming, not servant, not slave. In those tokens, he began to see an answer to the question that haunted him. He was not only what he did for others, he was also what he chose for himself. And each choice, humble though it seemed, wove him closer to a new identity, a free elf, discovering not just survival, but selfhood. The path was still uncertain, but Dobby had begun to walk it with steadier steps. The hollowness inside him no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space, waiting to be filled, and so he moved forward, with pouch clinking softly at his side, toward a future that would ask not what chains bound him, but what promises he would bind himself to. Instead, the first time Dobby stood beneath the arches of Hogwarts, as a free elf, he felt as if a giant hand had set him down upon the palm of a kindly giant. The stone did not glare the way other stones glared. It looked back with a grave amusement, as if it had seen too many lives arrive trembling and leave a little braver to waste severity on a small elf with a patched scarf. Wind stroked the turrets and came away smelling of broom twigs and lake water. Owls stitched dusk to roofline with their soft, serious thread. Dobby, who had learned to make himself a seam in harsher houses, found he could stand here and be a knot instead, visible, useful, holding something together. He did not march to the front doors and demand to belong. Belonging, he had learned, is earned in kitchens and corridors long before it is announced in offices, so he followed the smell of bread, fresh, crust singing, crumbs still dreaming, down staircases that liked to creep sideways mid-step, and into warmth. Hogwarts kitchens were a living map of welcome. Kettles conversing in little huffs, copper pans shyly bright, long tables that bore their scratches, like travel stories, and at the center of it all, an orchestra of house elves moving with the effortless grace of those who have done the same miracle 1,000 times and refused to call it small. They turned and saw him, saw the scarf, the sock, the way freedom sits on the shoulders like a bird undecided about staying, and the room drew a collective breath. Dobby bowed, not the frightened fold of spine he had given the Malfoys, but a greeting layered with respect. "Dobby is come," he said softly, "because names, spoken gently, are as good as credentials." For a moment, no one moved. Then a ladle clinked against a pot, approval's little knock, and the kitchen returned to its music, though some eyes stayed edged with worry, the way old stitches itch at changes in the weather. A matronly elf, with wrists that had whisked 100 winters into sweetness, approached, flour dusting her like first snow. "Hogwarts has food enough for any who will work," she murmured, not yet smiling, not yet frowning. "Will you work, little scarf?" "If allowed," Dobby answered, and his voice did a small, grateful curtsy to the ovens. Work is a language, and Dobby spoke it fluently. He slipped into the line where apples waited to be taught tenderness, turning his palm in the old coaxing circle that teaches fruit to give up its peel without shame. He hummed the yeast every kitchen has its note, and the dough climbed the bowl as if eager to see the ceiling. He fetched wood for the great hearth, stacking it in patient cradles so fire would wake kindly and not rush to boast. He polished the brass taps where pumpkin juice streams itself colder until they recognized their own reflections and sat up straighter. No one asked him to be invisible, no one demanded that his care arrive at parade rest. He tended flame as if it were a skittish animal, spoke to steam as if it were a guest, and in return the kitchen accepted his presence, the way a pond accepts an extra fallen leaf. A small change, quickly made part of the design. Not all eyes softened. A narrow-shouldered elf with a starch-stiff apron sniffed at the scarf and muttered, "Clothes make trouble." Another, younger and solemn, asked with honest confusion, "If you can leave, why would you stay to peel?" Dobby did not bristle. He set down the knife and lifted an apple to catch the lantern light. "Because apples must learn to be pie," he said, and the room, which had worried he was about to argue politics, let out a relief that sounded like a pan settling on a trivet. Between rushes of preparation, when the great hall's ceiling rehearsed the night's stars and the long tables went on whispering about who would sit where, Dobby wandered the edges of his new world. He learned the personalities of cupboards. This one aloof, insisting on being knocked. That one generous, giving up nutmeg even when nutmeg had not been asked for. He befriended a sulky pump that only delivered water if praised, and an overproud knife that cut straighter when ignored. House elves are archivists of small character, and Hogwarts offered a whole library. It offered faces too that made room for him without making a ceremony of it. A portrait of a stout woman in pearls kept watch over a passage to the cellars. She peered at Dobby, declared, "You have good chowder hands," and refused to explain what that meant. A suit of armor tried to bow and nearly collapsed. Dobby tightened its straps and suggested it practice nodding instead. Even the ghosts, who fluttered through columns like unasked questions, sometimes paused to listen when Dobby sang to a pan. There is something about a well-seasoned melody that persuades the past to settle. And then there were the students. He watched them from the kitchen's door, the way a lighthouse watches ships, not prying, but protective by habit. Children arguing over jam. Children sharing secrets with a biscuit between them like a treaty. Children arriving late and pretending they had not run. Dobby's chest did a curious ache, then the ache of joy that gets mistaken for sadness, because he had never belonged to any childhood but had helped keep so many afloat. To place bread on a table across which a lonely first year would discover a friend felt like placing a brick in a bridge he himself might one day cross. He had expected the castle to tolerate him. He had not expected it to confide, but places sense caretakers, and Hogwarts is a place with more mood than most countries. On his third night, while the rain played its old tune against the windows, Dobby felt a tug in the flagstones near the scullery. Not a warning, an inquiry. He knelt and pressed his ear to the warm stone. Pipes coughed somewhere, then laughed. The castle was asking, in its drafty dialect, whether this small newcomer intended to stay. Dobby smoothed the floor with his palm, the way one smooths a rumpled pillow for someone else, and said, "If Hogwarts will have Dobby, Dobby will have Hogwarts." He began, quietly, to mend the kinds of things that do not earn anyone's name on a plaque. A squeak in the hinge outside the hospital wing that woke anxious sleepers. He taught it to sigh instead. A draft that insisted on creeping under a particular door, where homework found children who did not need another excuse. He persuaded it to go glance at the astronomy tower instead, where drafts acquire better manners. I learned which steps like to flirt with clumsiness, and gave them a stricter edge on exam mornings. He did not ask permission for these magics. He gave thanks when they worked, and apologized to the air when they did not. Meals showed him the rhythm of the castle's heart. Breakfast arrived like a polite alarm. Porridge with a seriousness that suited Latin grammar, eggs with a cheer. The staircases tried to imitate. Lunch barged in, telling jokes. Supper went on thinking it was a ball, and sometimes forgot to sit down. Through all of it, Dobby learned to hear when a tray wanted another set of hands, when a student's laugh was buoyant enough to carry a second helping to someone who hadn't asked, when the staff table required an extra pot of tea, placed precisely where a conversation was about to need softening. He had always been a steward of atmospheres. Now he was allowed to be a maestro, however quietly. Some nights he carried a covered plate along passages only elves use, up to a door that smelled of lemon drops and old courage. He never intruded. He left the plate where it would be found with the dignity of discovery rather than the embarrassment of need. Once, as he set down a napkin folded into a phoenix, he had practiced the wings 3 times behind a barrel. He heard footsteps and froze. The headmaster's voice. A warm lantern drifted around the corner. "Ah, the fold you've chosen lends itself to rebirth." Dobby's ears prickled. He did not turn. "Hogwarts is kind to hands that choose," the voice continued, and a lemon-sweet pause followed. "When you are ready to speak of terms, I should like to listen." The footsteps wandered on, 2 beats of twinkle, then Dobby stood very still and felt something steady inside him. Like a table, learning it has 4 good legs, the other elves observed. Some thawed enough to ask how scarfed weather felt. One, older than the others, sniffed and said, "Work must not be bought," as if coins would teach pots to lie. Dobby did not argue. He simply kept showing up with his courtesies. When an apprentice scullion dropped a stack of plates and burst into tears, Dobby sat on the floor beside her and turned each shard into a small, moon-bright fish. By the time they had caught them all with their hands and laughter, fear had forgotten what it was doing there. The older elf passed by and said nothing. But the next morning a spoon appeared at Dobby's station that fit his fingers as if it had been thinking of them for years. On a blue and breezy afternoon, while the lake practiced imitating the sky and the greenhouses smelled like good arguments won by sunlight, Dobby followed the slow bell that calls afternoon tea into being. He watched steam rise from kettles, like polite ghosts, and arranged biscuits in alternating flavors, so the plate felt as fair as a story. He placed a small cup at the end of a tray, one more than was typically sent, and though no one asked, no one removed it. Later that day, he heard from a portrait that a shy professor had found courage in a spare cup. Dobby polished the tray that night as if polishing a star one can hold. Work, when chosen, began to teach him who he was. He discovered he liked the moment just before the first loaf is cut, the hush full of future slices. He liked hearing the tired in a footstep and building a plate that could persuade it to sit down. He liked knowing which jam rescued which mood. He liked being the reason a corridor smelled faintly of cinnamon right when a homesick child happened to pass. He liked, most of all, the way the castle's breathing evened out when he walked its edges with a pocket full of mending spells and an ear tuned to creaks that meant worry. Money had not entered the conversation yet, nor titles, nor terms. Still, Dobby felt the shape of a new pact assembling itself. Not the old silk-strong vow that tangled love with fear, but a braid of offering, respect, and yes, coin, perhaps to mark that what he gave was not property's due, but craft's exchange. The idea sat in him like yeast in warm milk, beginning to rise. He would not rush it. Bread, punished for being hurried. turns sulky, agreements do too. That evening, as dinner's clatter softened into the satisfied silence of homework, Dobby slipped outside. The lawn breathed cool against his toes. Above, the ceiling of the sky had borrowed its stars back from the great hall and scattered them with less ceremony, but more sincerity. He took the pouch of tokens he carried, feather, pebble, thread, and added a new thing, a crumb from a loaf he had chosen to bake in a place he had chosen to stand. It felt right, the way a well-placed plate feels right, to mark the beginning of work that answered not fear but calling. He did not know what tomorrow's conversation with the kind voice behind lemon drops would bring. He only knew that his hands had found their way into a kitchen where love was measured in ladles and minutes held open for someone else, and that the work he had started here was making a sound inside him like a door, learning the difference between opened and forced. And so, with the ovens settling to sleep and the dishes stacked like tame moons, Dobby walked back into the warm copper-scented dark, ready to learn how a free elf talks about wages without making the old magic flinch, ready to ask for respect as one more ingredient in the recipe of service, ready to discover what it means for gratitude and coin to share a plate without quarreling, ready at last to speak. The night was quiet, its silence broken only by the crackle of embers settling in the vast fireplaces of the Hogwarts kitchens. When the moment finally arrived, Dobby, who had spent weeks proving that he could work without compulsion, who had shown the other elves that freedom did not mean idleness, was summoned at last to the headmaster's office. The spiraling staircase carried him upwards as if on a tide, each step gliding into place beneath his patched shoes. At the summit, the griffin-shaped knocker regarded him with a kind of solemn curiosity before swinging open, and Dobby stepped into a room where the air smelled faintly of lemon drops and parchment, where portraits dozed in their gilded frames, and where a phoenix slept upon its perch with feathers that glowed faintly like banked fire. Albus Dumbledore was waiting. His blue eyes, half-shadowed by spectacles, twinkled, not with mockery, but with the warmth of a man who saw before him not a servant but a soul. "Dobby," he said gently, "you have walked the first steps of freedom with grace, but tell me, what is it you seek now?" The little elf wrung his hands upon his scarf. His ears trembled, though his voice was steady. "Dobby is wanting to belong, not as slave, not as property. Dobby is wanting work that is chosen. Dobby is wanting to serve, but not because he must, because he wishes." Dumbledore inclined his head, as though such words were the finest music. "And you believe this place might allow such a thing?" "Dobby is thinking," said the elf, "that Hogwarts is kind." "Dobby is thinking that Hogwarts has always been kind to Harry Potter, sir. And Dobby is hoping Hogwarts might be kind to Dobby also." A long silence followed, filled only by the soft rustle of the phoenix's feathers. Then Dumbledore leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Tell me, Dobby, what payment do you believe your work is worth?" The question startled the elf more than any rebuke. Payment, wages. Such words felt strange, as though they belonged to wizards only. The other elves had scoffed at the very thought, but Dobby, clutching his scarf, whispered, "Dobby is hearing that wizards take galleons for work. Dobby is thinking 1 galleon a week might be fair." Dumbledore's lips curved into a smile that was both proud and sad. "A galleon is indeed a fine wage for many. Yet I would offer you more, 10 galleons a week, and time to rest." Dobby gasped, horrified. "Oh, no, sir. That is too much, far too much." Dobby is not wanting to be greedy. 1 galleon, and perhaps 1 day off. That is plenty. And so it was agreed, not because Dumbledore could not have insisted otherwise, but because he understood that dignity rests in choice. Dobby would serve in the kitchens, not as chattel, but as worker. His labour returned with coin he might keep or spend as he pleased, his service shaped by his own will. The other elves whispered still. Some pitied him, some mocked him, others shunned him entirely. To them, Dobby's wages were shameful, an insult to tradition. They muttered that clothes had turned his mind soft, that freedom had broken him. But Dobby, clutching his pouch of tokens and now a single gleaming coin, felt richer than any Malfoy. For the galleon in his hand was not mere gold. It was proof that his work was his own. Proof that choice could blossom even in the shadow of ancient customs. proof that an elf might live, not as a possession, but as a being who mattered. And so Dobby's days at Hogwarts truly began. Not as prisoner, not as outcast, but as one who had forged a new path, however narrow, through courage and quiet persistence. The path ahead, though, was not without thorns, for not all elves shared his vision, and the meaning of freedom would soon be tested in ways he could scarcely imagine. The kitchens of Hogwarts bustled like a living symphony, pots clanging in cheerful rhythm, fires humming their deep-throated bass, and house elves darting like nimble violins, each one keeping time to a score written long before Dobby arrived. Yet within that harmony, he felt the discord of his presence, his scarf, his wages, his freedom. These were notes that jarred the old melody. The other elves worked with devotion so complete it seemed like breathing. To them, serving Hogwarts was not duty, but joy, a fulfillment of the pact, as old as their race. They polished goblets with love, stirred stews with pride, folded napkins as though tucking in children, and when they looked at Dobby, they saw an elf who had stepped out of the dance. Creature was the most disdainful, visiting from time to time with orders from his master's portrait at Grimmauld Place. He curled his lip whenever Dobby's scarf caught his eye. Disgraceful, he would mutter. Clothes spoiled, ruined. Elves are made for service, not wages. His words struck like thorns, sharp with centuries of tradition. Others whispered behind their hands, pitying him as though he were a broken toy. Poor Dobby, they sighed. He has forgotten what elves are. When he passed, they turned away, unwilling to be tainted by his strangeness. Even those who treated him kindly kept their distance, their smiles edged with unease. It hurt, more than he admitted, more than the punishments of Malfoy Manor ever had, for there is a loneliness sharper than chains. The loneliness of standing apart from one's own kind. Dobby would lie awake in his corner of the kitchens, coin pouch clutched to his chest, and wonder if he had erred. Was freedom truly worth exile from his people? Was choice worth the silence of his kin? And yet, when dawn returned and fires called for tending, when the smell of baking bread filled the air and students' laughter drifted faintly through the floorboards, Dobby's resolve would kindle again. He remembered Harry Potter's kindness. He remembered the sock that had broken the chain. He remembered the galleon that jingled like hope itself, and he whispered to himself, yes, freedom is worth it, always worth it. He threw himself into his work, not to prove himself to others, but to prove to his own heart that service freely given could still be joy. He polished cauldrons until they shone like moons, arranged feasts with artistry that made tables look like paintings, and tended fires with such care that the warmth seemed to carry comfort into every corridor. Students noticed, though they did not know his name. They spoke of the suppers that felt brighter, the breakfasts that began with cheer. They never knew it was Dobby's choice, poured into every loaf and every ladle. Still, conflict simmered. Once, when he proudly showed another elf the galleon he had earned, she recoiled as if burned. Money dirties service, she whispered. It makes love into bargain. Dobby's ears drooped, and he tucked the coin away. The shame. But later, when he bought himself a pair of socks, bright and mismatched, chosen simply because they made him smile, he felt again the thrill of ownership, of choice. He danced alone in the kitchens that night, feet warm, heart warmer. Dumbledore, watching quietly from afar, never interfered. He trusted Dobby to walk this new road himself, but sometimes when the headmaster passed the kitchens, he would pause just long enough to murmur, "You honor us, Dobby, by teaching us all what service means." Those words sustained him through the coldest stares of his kin, and though loneliness still pressed close, Dobby carried within him the certainty that he was walking a path none had walked before, and that one day, perhaps others might follow. There is a way. Some names move through a building, as if the stone itself has learned to carry them softly, so that long before the person arrives, their presence is already a warmth along the corridor. Harry's name did this at Hogwarts. It went ahead of him like the smell of rain before rain, easing shutters, smoothing tempers, reminding even the more irritable portraits to be brave instead of merely loud. Dobby felt it most in the kitchens, where kettles perked up when the syllables drifted down the stairwell, where the bread rose more eagerly, where his own small heart remembered the day a sock became a sky. Their first meeting as free elf and free boy did not happen in the Great Hall, with its starry ceiling and the confidence of ceremony. It happened in the gentler geography of the kitchens, among steam that forgives, among tables that welcome elbows, among aprons that smell faintly of nutmeg. Harry slipped in with friends whose curiosity had learned to be kind, and Dobby, catching sight of that impossible hair and those very alive eyes, forgot, just for a heartbeat, every careful lesson about not making a fuss. "Harry Potter, sir?" The words leapt out of him like birds startled into joy. He clasped his hands to keep them from flying further, ears bright with a happiness that embarrassed only the spoons. Harry's smile, crooked, true, made the room stand a little taller. "Dobby," he answered, as if Dobby were the important name in the sentence, and the elf's knees nearly gave way with gratitude at being seen like that. It is not only grand gestures that bind people. It is the sharing of very small times. Harry listened when Dobby spoke about wages, as if coin were a kind of courage one must practice, nodded solemnly at the revelation that a day off sits strangely on the first few tries, laughed, not at Dobby but with him, over the discovery that socks, when chosen, can be a philosophy. Dobby, in turn, listened to the boy's tiredness, which hid under jokes the way shyness hides behind curtains. He heard the rustle of burdens Harry did not want to lay on anyone's plate, and he tucked extra warmth into the cocoa that found its way to the common room when nights were long. Gifts began to move between them, shy at first, then delighted. Dobby brought presents the way the dawn brings light into corners. Suddenly, tenderly, with an eagerness that apologized for nothing, a pair of socks, knitted from wool too enthusiastic to match its fellow. One orange like a sunrise that got the giggles, the other green like a field pretending at heroism. A tea cozy that believed itself a hat, and looked very handsome about it. A tiny carved badger that claimed it was a spoon rest, and then spent its life being a pocket friend. Harry received these with the respect due to sacred objects. He laughed. Yes, but he kept. He thanked with a seriousness that told Dobby his making mattered. And Harry gave, also. Not merely things, though there were things. Socks wrapped in paper that had listened while being folded. Sweets that tasted of the permission to be a child. But time, which in heroes is the rarest currency. He lingered after his friends had gone, asking how the ovens felt in rain, what song the bread preferred on Tuesdays, whether coin bent the flavour of labour or only made it glint. He addressed Dobby's choices as if they were a new branch of magic, and Dobby its professor. The other elves, listening from their work, did not altogether approve, but even their disapproval learned the habit of silence when faced with such courtesy. Some afternoons, when the castle's light lay long on the tables and the rush before supper paused to breathe, Dobby would walk the secret ways to the Gryffindor common room and make small, invisible adjustings that friendship authorizes. The armchair that remembered Harry's back from nights of homework and worry was coaxed to hold its shape precisely longer. The hearth learned not to spit at the exact moment a page leaned too close. A plate of mince pies arrived on a windowsill exactly when a certain trio of friends forgot to eat because they were too busy planning to be brave. No note explained these mercies. Harry's thanks when he puzzled out the hand behind them. Never asked for proof. He simply looked into the room and said, softly, "Cheers, Dobby," and the furniture, feeling properly credited, arranged itself more cooperatively. Once, on a night when the corridors carried a restlessness that had nothing to do with wind, Dobby found Harry sitting alone by the kitchen door, face lit from below by a lantern that kept forgetting to be steady. The castle was holding its breath. Even the portraits had decided to practice discretion. Dobby brought a mug, whose steam smelled like calm, and sat on the floor, because important conversations prefer the level where feet can be honest. Harry did not explain the whole of his worry. Heroes understand that some burdens bruise in the telling, but he said enough, and Dobby answered not with advice. Advice is a delicate spice, and must be used sparingly, but with stories about kettles that boil over if watched too fiercely, about dough that rises better when the baker trusts it, about doors that open more politely if you do not push them at the hinge. Harry laughed at the translation, and grew quieter in the right places. When he left, the lantern remembered how to hold still. Their friendship did not parade itself. It worked the way good stitching works, hidden and strong. During a winter that arrived with extra teeth, Dobby learned which of Harry's gloves did not quite love the left hand and taught it how. On mornings when the castle's cold thought itself clever, the corridor outside Harry's dormitory would warm 3 degrees in a way no thermometer could accuse. When exams came raging in like weather that wants to be dramatic, a bowl of sugared peel Pella's old kindness, borrowed across distance, would find its way to a pocket at the moment when concentration sagged. Harry never needed to ask how or why. Dobby never demanded gratitude. The thread between them did its work, and it held. Socks, that old covenant, became a language of their own. Dobby wore his mismatched banners, not only for joy, but for philosophy, to remind the world that pair does not have to mean same, that belonging is not obedience in prettier clothes. Harry took the point gladly. He brought Dobby patterns with creatures that argued about moons, with stars that refused to stay in their lanes, with tiny lightning bolts that insisted on being more cheerful than lightning usually is. Dobby, receiving these, pressed them to his chest with a reverence that made even Creature look away for decency's sake. There were disagreements too, because real friendship allows for them. Harry, generous to a fault, sometimes tried to refuse a favour, not wishing to make Dobby a servant again by accident. Dobby, who knew the difference now between being commanded and being allowed, had to teach him that joyful work is not a chain. Please, he would say, ears tilting toward plea, not habit. Let Dobby do this, because Dobby wants to. Harry learned to accept help the way brave people learn to rest. Awkwardly at first, then with relief that feels like guilt, until it doesn't. When danger darkened the edges of school years, as it always did, like a season the calendar won't print, Dobby's watchfulness lengthened. He could not stop storms from forming, but he could set towels where the leaks were likely to show. If Harry's path tilted toward peril, the castle would find, mysteriously, that the path had acquired one extra railing. If curfew became a negotiation with necessity, the paintings along a certain route would grow drowsy at the critical moment. Dobby did not call this protection, he called it tidying. But his tidying, like an angel's, had a way of arriving exactly where it was needed. In quieter pockets of time, they shared things that did not need saving. Harry told Dobby about a game that turned the sky into rules and freedom at once. Dobby listened with the solemnity due to a flying sport, invented to make gravity less sure of itself. Dobby, in return, taught Harry a scullery charm that takes the sting out of onions, and another that persuades tears to fall somewhere useful when they need to. They tried the onion one on a Saturday, and the other stayed politely in theory. It mattered that they had these ordinary experiments between the extraordinary ones, that their friendship had cupboards labelled every day. If you had asked the castle, which knows what it knows without pomp, it would have said, here was a thread binding high to low, famous to small, wand magic to the older craft of making the world gentle. It would have said the boy made the elf brave about asking, and the elf made the boy brave about accepting. It would have said that, in a place built for learning, these two learned the best lesson, that love given freely knows how to return without being called. One evening near term's end, with summer rehearsing itself in the smell of grass and the far, shrill practice of swallows, Harry pressed into Dobby's palm a little parcel, folded like a secret taught to trust. Inside lay socks, so wildly unmatched, they appeared to be telling each other jokes. For your collection, Harry said, as if the collection were a museum, and Dobby its director. Dobby, who retained a scholar's reverence for artifacts that change lives, nodded gravely and then smiled, so fiercely the lamps wished to dim to give the smile room. Harry Potter gives Dobby choice, he said, and Harry, who had only meant to give socks, accepted the larger truth without flinching. So, the friendship grew, unspectacular to those who count spectacle as proof, luminous to those who keep score in quiet reliefs. A meal arriving before hunger has to ask twice, a corridor warmed, a word remembered, a hand not taken because it was not needed, and then offered exactly when it was, and beneath it all, a vow Dobby did not speak aloud, because vows prefer to be kept in the chest until needed, that when the world tilted toward cruelty, he would tilt back with all his small might in the direction of the boy who had called him by his name. Soon the matter of clothes and choice would rise again, like a question that has found better language, and Dobby would answer it not only with socks, but with a creed. But for now the kitchen breathed, the castle slept, and two friends, one famous, one free, moved through it, so gently the night itself seemed to rest easier for their passing. Clothes, to wizards, were often only a question of robes or colours, of tradition or vanity. To house elves, they were destiny, a rag tied around the waist, a pillowcase sewn roughly at the seams, a tea towel looped about the shoulders. These were the markers of servitude, symbols that bound tighter than chains. For centuries the elves had been told that clothing freely given meant exile, rejection, a severing from their place in the world. They clung to their rags with a pride that to outsiders seemed pitiable, but to them was heritage, safety and law. Yet in Dobby's hands, socks were liberation. Scarves were laughter, hats were rebellion. In wool and thread, he collected them the way some wizards collected wands or books, each pair a banner declaring that he was no longer a creature of ownership, but a being of choice. When he walked through Hogwarts kitchens in mismatched patterns and colours so bold they made the silverware blink, the other elves whispered as though he carried contraband fire. "Clothes are shame," muttered one. "Clothes make an elf lost." But Dobby would smile, ears lifting high, and answer softly, "Clothes are freedom. They are Dobby's joy." He did not force them. Never once did he press a sock into unwilling hands, though he sometimes tried, with the innocence of a child offering sweets, to show how warm and kind it felt to choose. Winky, broken-hearted after her dismissal, wept into butterbeer and cursed the garment that had exiled her from Crouch service. Dobby sat beside her, offering silence more than words, showing by example that clothes need not mean shame. They could mean love. For Harry's gifts, especially, became talismans. Socks with dancing snitches that trailed gold as though the fabric itself played Quidditch. A scarlet pair embroidered clumsily with Gryffindor lions each time Harry gave him something. Dobby cradled it as though it were no less sacred than a wand, pressing it against his chest before wearing it proudly, until the threads frayed thin. In those colours he carried not only cloth, but friendship stitched into every seam. The castle learned too. Students began to notice that the elf with the eccentric socks was never bowed, never shrinking. His back, though small, was straight as a wand, his step quickened with purpose. When he polished a goblet, it gleamed with a light that seemed borrowed from stars. When he swept the hearth, warmth lingered longer in the stones. A hush often followed his passing, a curiosity among young witches and wizards. Here was a servant who smiled like a master of his own fate. Still, the disapproval of his kin weighed upon him. At feasts, while he stacked platters and filled pitchers, whispers pricked his ears sharper than knives. Not right, some said. Not proper. Yet even when their words bruised, Dobby answered them with gentleness. One day, maybe, another elf will want a sock too, and Dobby will help. In quiet hours, when the kitchen slumbered and the fires glowed low, he would sit cross-legged on the floor and spread his collection before him. Bright, absurd, holy, each pair carried a memory. The first sock, grey and humble, that had broken Lucius Malfoy's hold. Harry's Christmas gifts, wrapped in paper crinkled with care. The striped pair bought with his own coin, chosen only because it made him laugh. To any wizard, they were scraps of wool. To Dobby, they were proof of life remade. And so, clothes became not only garments, but language. Each morning's choice was a declaration. Freedom in mismatched stripes, courage in crimson, joy in yellow polka dots. He spoke without speaking, teaching the world that dignity is not in uniformity, but in the power to choose. As the years at Hogwarts deepened, this truth rooted itself quietly in the stones. Perhaps one day the other elves would see, perhaps not. But Dobby carried no bitterness. He knew that seeds take time, and even if they never sprouted among his kin, the soil of his own heart would remain rich with freedom watered by the kindness of a boy who had once handed him a sock. And beyond the socks, beyond the scarves and hats, lay the greater truth he had discovered, that love is never servitude when it is freely given. The world outside Hogwarts was growing darker, and even the kitchens could not keep out its shadow. Owls arrived with tidings that made teachers whisper in corners, and the students' laughter carried a new edge, as if each joke were an attempt to chase away fear. The name Voldemort, once spoken only in shudders, returned to the air with a hiss like wind through broken glass. Dobby, who had ears tuned to currents others could not feel, heard the tremor in the very stones. Among the elves, whispers spread too, though their tongues were cautious. They spoke in hints while chopping roots, in murmurs while polishing brass. He who must not be named is stirring again. Old masters grow bold. Some families are summoning their elves to serve in darker ways. Dobby listened, heart aching, for he remembered too well the cruelties of Malfoy Manor, the taste of fear in every command, the punishments that masqueraded as tradition. Unlike the others, Dobby was free. He could choose to listen or choose to act. And yet, freedom did not erase his bond with his people. Their mutters of unease were like the cries of birds before a storm, soft but undeniable. Some elves, bound by oaths older than themselves, carried messages through secret channels, smuggling whispers of dark meetings and dangerous allegiances. Others, trembling, admitted that their masters' voices had grown harsher, their orders crueler. Dobby tried to comfort them, though most shunned his words. Freedom is not betrayal, he told them gently as they kneaded bread or scrubbed tables. Choice is not shame. If masters ask for wickedness, elves are not wicked for refusing. But the others flinched, fearful even to hear such thoughts spoken. Creature snarled once that Dobby's tongue was poisoned with rebellion. Winky, sunk in her grief, could only shake her head. Still, Dobby persisted. He carried hope in small acts. He nudged a frightened elf to slip a warning into a wizard's pocket. He persuaded a doorway to stay closed just long enough for danger to pass. He whispered courage into kitchens where despair had begun to root. Though he was mocked, though he was mistrusted, he knew that even the smallest candle could push back the dark. At Hogwarts, Dobby's own work became an act of resistance. Every plate he set down, every fire he tended, every corridor he warmed with unseen kindness became part of his quiet vow to keep the castle a refuge. He polished the banisters so they shone like promises, arranged feasts that reminded weary students that joy still had a place, and sang to the cauldrons in a voice steadier than he felt. He could not stop the shadows gathering beyond the walls, but he could make sure that, inside, there was light. In the evenings, when the students had gone to their dormitories and the kitchens hummed low with rest, Dobby sat alone with his socks spread around him. Each pair was a reminder of freedom, of friendship, of the boy who had shown him kindness. He held them close, whispering to himself, "If Harry Potter can stand against darkness, so can Dobby, so can all elves, if they dare." And though his kin did not yet believe him, though the storm was only beginning to break, Dobby's courage grew in silence. He was learning that freedom carried not only joy, but duty, a duty chosen, not imposed, and he was ready, when the time came, to answer that duty with all his small but steadfast heart. Resistance, when it is small and true, seldom bangs on doors. It learns the hinges by touch, oils them with patience, and teaches them to open at the right moment and only for the right feet. In those gathering years, when rules learned to stare and pink lace hid teeth, Dobby's work grew a second heartbeat. The first was the kitchen's pulse, bread rising, kettles steady, knives kept sharp but not cruel. The second was the quiet beat of refusal, not grand, not shouted, but stubborn as a dandelion flowering between flagstones. He began by re-educating corridors. Hallways at Hogwarts have their own opinions, especially when made to carry authority that has not earned its weight. Dobby walked the long stones with a palm at his side. "Listen," he asked, turning to take its time, when a certain woman in a cardigan, the colour of sugared poison, marched past. He coaxed a stare to lengthen by one extra step, when a boy with a badge pinned to his chest enjoyed catching others more than catching his breath. These adjustments were not sabotage. They were reminders issued to architecture that dignity is also a rule. When the whispers of a secret class began to flicker, children seeking a place to practice the kind of courage that refuses to curtsy, Dobby felt the castle itself answer. Places like to be used properly. A room that had spent years hoarding spare intentions stirred like a bell. He found it by following absence the way one follows a scent. A wall too quiet, a seam in air where drafts hesitated, the hum a house makes when it is ready to keep a promise. He stepped past stone that had decided to be a door, and into a space that introduced itself as if it had been waiting for applause. It was not proud, it was relieved. Here, Dobby told the room, the children will need somewhere to put their bravery while it tries on different sizes. The room understood. It laid out cushions for falling and shelves for trying again. It piled practice dummies into agreeable heaps. It collected chalk and patience. It offered windows that only looked out on weather conducive to learning. And when Dobby took Harry aside, boy and elf in a small pocket of passage, where portraits pretended to be asleep, and spoke of a door that appears when called kindly, Harry's eyes did the quick, bright thing that happens when hope recognizes a map. From then on, Dobby became the room's quiet usher. He showed it the names to listen for. He taught it which footsteps were planning good trouble and which were merely planning to strut. He persuaded the floorboards to be brave about silence when a cat's soft patrol passed outside. He trained the dust to settle quickly after a flurry of spells, so noses would not betray what lungs had practiced. When an inquisitive caretaker's nostrils flared nearby, Dobby sent the smell of polish into the corridor, the way one sends a tune into a room to cover an awkward pause. Signals grew between friends who never signed treaties. The mirrors learned to cloud for a heartbeat when danger approached, then clear as if embarrassed. The doorknob took to warming under the hand that meant well, and cooling at the touch that would punish. A portrait of a lady with a teacup agreed to tilt just slightly when it was safe. She enjoyed the drama and asked only that someone dust her frame on Thursdays. Dobby, who understood the economies of gratitude, kept the cloth ready. He had help in the old-fashioned way. Not from conspirators, but from furniture and fixtures that had grown tired of being bossed by the wrong sort of certainty. The cat plates that smiled down with syrupy smugness learned to blink twice. If a corridor had recently been told a lie, the umbrella stand near a certain office acquired an inconvenient habit of toppling at the precise moment. A quill poised to sign a punishment too harsh for its subject. Even the sugar bowl on a dreadful desk turned lumpy in protest whenever cruelty tried to sweeten itself with tea. Some evenings when the DA, though few used the name, as if saying it too loudly might break its skin, was finishing the day's practice, Dobby would sweep through the room of requirement with a tray that had learned invisibility in wartime. He left mugs whose steam remembered forests, biscuits that tasted of older summers, a plate of orange slices arranged into a sun as if to remind courage that it does not have to be stern to be real. He collected the shattered remnants of fear that practicing always shakes loose and carried them away as if clearing plates, humming so the room would not be embarrassed by its mess. When inspections came, because power enjoys the slow pageantry of catching things, Dobby set the castle's reaction to polite inconvenience. Keys hid behind the wrong curtains. A ladder forgot how to be climbed by anyone wearing a certain perfume. Quills leaked onto the sleeves most fond of writing reports. Nothing that could be punished as sabotage. Everything that could be borne as bad luck. Children reached classrooms with hair incongruously windblown, as if justice had stuck its head out of a train window just for joy. He watched over the trio who seemed to collect trouble as if it were a house pet. Harry's shoulders carried determination like a borrowed coat, too big, yet somehow fitting. Hermione's thoughts moved like quick stitches, repairing as they went. Ron's loyalty stood in doorways with its arms crossed, pretending to be a joke until it needed to be a shield. Dobby adjusted the world around them a fraction to be kinder. A door that stuck a heartbeat longer for anyone giving chase. A suit of armor that suddenly remembered it had always been placed 3 inches to the left, forcing a detour. A tapestry that decided to be more interesting than an inquiry, and occupied a corridor with its story until the wrong eyes wandered away. When posters multiplied, smiling kittens, and commandments written as if rules could purr, Dobby answered with a kind of house magic that does not sign petitions but makes staying human easier. He slipped extra blankets to cold shoulders that had been deprived of comfort for discipline's sake. He charmed a fountain in a remote corner to speak encouragement that sounded like running water, so no one would be embarrassed to stand near it and be told they were doing fine. He taught the library lamps to stay a fraction warmer at the desks where the lonely sat, because loneliness chills even in summer. Punishments for small daring began to carry the smell of new ink and old spite. Detention became a word with splinters in it. Dobby stood at the thresholds of those rooms, unseen, unthanked, and folded gentleness into their edges. He persuaded the chairs to take better care of spines. He coached the clock hands to move with occasional mischief. He whispered to the walls that it is unkind to echo scolding the way it is to echo songs. And the walls, who had once been young stone, remembered what it meant to be good. Acoustics. He took risks that would have seemed impossible when his life belonged to Malfoy Manor. Once, noticing a decreed hunt through corridors for a list that should never have existed, he taught the parchment to forget it was paper and remember it had been a feather. It escaped through a window as a gull, with a memory for Salt. Another time, a quill that took statements learned to weep and blotted out a confession before the child's second sentence, so that shame had less to hold. When accused minds prowled the library, he gave the card catalogue an itch. It sneezed up so many false cross-references that searchers went away certain there was nothing worth finding. But the bravest acts were the smallest ones. The cup of broth that found the boy who had hidden his hurt under a staircase. The napkin that learned to sit in a girl's pocket and grow absorbent when tears insisted on coming in lessons. The broom cupboard that decided to smell of lavender instead of fear. Resistance is often the art of asking ordinary things to be extraordinary in defense of the tender. Not all days succeeded. There were afternoons when authority breezed in like weather with a schedule and a smile, and Dobby could do nothing but stand aside and memorize the faces he would later comfort. On those nights he sat amid his socks, banners, bandages, and felt the ache of being small against a system that had taught itself to be large. He punished himself no longer. He had learned to be kinder to the creature whose hands he used. But he did not spare himself an inventory. Where had the door failed to misbehave? Which hinge could learn a better squeak? Which staircase might be taught the art of second thoughts? The room of requirement, faithful as a kettle that knows when to sing, began to request Dobby's company even when empty. He tidied the learning that would happen tomorrow. He whispered thanks to cushions. He tucked courage into the corners in case someone came in and needed to borrow some at once. It was here that he sometimes found Luna, walking as if the air were telling her something interesting, and he would offer her a plate of biscuits shaped like stars. She, in turn, would tell him about kindnesses delivered by creatures no one else believed in, and they would agree, companionably, that disbelief is not a very good reason to stop doing good. As the year deepened, danger gathered like wool on brambles. Still, the castle held. It changed under the pressure. Rooms learn new purposes when told to forget their old ones, but it did not forget itself entirely, and Dobby claimed a portion of that memory for the children. He could not stop decrees from breeding on walls, but he taught the plaster to remember handprints left by students carrying their books, the smudges of ink and jam that say, "We were here, and we were hungry and learning and alive." The walls, flattered, held those traces like talisman. News from beyond the grounds often arrived like weather reports written by people who liked storms. Dobby read the air instead. He met it with extra loaves, with tea that steeped a minute longer, with socks that could be pulled up past cold shins. He refused to let the castle forget its most radical promise. But within these stones, children are allowed to practice becoming themselves without admiration for the opposite of that promise standing in the doorway and calling itself tradition. One evening, near curfew, Harry paused at the threshold of the hidden room and looked back, as if he could see through stone to where Dobby stood smoothing nothing in particular. "Thanks," he said, to the corridor, to the air, to the idea that rooms can be on your side. Dobby bowed to the idea back, because gratitude, like resistance, does its best work quietly. In this way, by cushioning, delaying, hiding, warming, reminding, the small defiance knit itself into the castle's daily life. It did not win headlines, but it won pauses, breaths, tiny reprieves, in which bravery could gather itself for the larger thing. Dobby carried these victories the way he carried his tokens: feather, pebble, thread, crumb, now also a pinch of chalk dust, saved from a lesson where a child finally mastered a charm that placed their own name gently where it belonged. And as the notices on the walls learned the habit of curling at the corners in damp weather, as the cat plates blinked their secret warnings, as the hidden room grew confident in its power to appear for those who needed it, Dobby felt something inside him toughen, not into hardness, but into steadiness, like a rope that has been used properly and now trusts itself to hold. And from that steadiness, the next kind of courage began to climb, hand over hand, toward the darker corridor ahead. Courage does not arrive with banners or horns. It creeps in like dawn, pale at first, fragile, and then, without notice, it fills every corner until shadows have no room left. For Dobby, courage had once been the trembling hand that accepted a sock, the whisper that dared to say no when cruelty demanded yes. But as years passed, and the darkness thickened across Britain, his courage grew not in sudden bursts, but in layers, one upon another, until it clothed him more completely than any scarf or hat. He found it in silence when other elves would not meet his eyes. He found it in Harry's smile, that unspoken trust which asked nothing and gave everything. He found it in the castle itself, whose walls had begun to lean closer to him, as if they knew he was one of their quiet guardians. Where once he had quaked under Malfoy orders, now he stood in kitchens where no master's command reached, choosing with his own hands what kindness to weave into food, what warmth to pour into cauldrons. Where once punishment had been his shadow, now choice was his lantern. And with that lantern, he began to see clearly how resistance was not always grand battles, but small refusals repeated until they became unbreakable. The whispers of Voldemort's return were no longer whispers. They were facts painted on sky and ground, in disappearances, in the fear on students' faces, in the tremor of owls carrying letters that weighed heavier than parchment should. The elves muttered of masters who grew cruel, of orders that tasted of blood. Some spoke of having to polish wands that had been used for terrible things. Dobby listened, heart steady where once it would have quivered. He no longer trembled at the mention of Voldemort. Fear had not vanished, but it had learned to kneel before his greater loyalty. Every act became a decision, and every decision was a step of courage. When he slipped an extra roll of bread into the hand of a hungry student, it was courage. When he turned his mismatched socks into banners of hope, it was courage. When he sat by Winky in her grief, offering not command but company, it was courage. For courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to walk hand in hand with it, and Dobby walked that road daily. That night, when fires dimmed and the castle grew quiet, Dobby sat by the hearth, gazing at flames that licked the air with restless hunger. He thought of Harry often, the boy who had given him freedom not only from chains but from believing chains were natural. He whispered his name like a spell of protection, a promise to himself that when Harry needed him again, he would come, no matter the cost. The other elves, though distant, began to sense his strength. Some mocked him still, but their words carried less bite, for they saw that he was not broken by them. Others secretly began to admire his strange path. A few even tried on socks in secret, if only for a night, to feel what choice might be like. They always returned to their rags by dawn, ashamed or afraid, but Dobby never judged. Seeds do not demand to sprout in winter, they only ask for a place to wait until spring, and in his own heart, Dobby knew spring was coming. Dark, long, merciless winter though it might be, still, somewhere beyond, there was light waiting to be born. So, he prepared, not with weapons but with will. He trained his courage daily, in the quiet art of care. He polished silver until it shone like shields. He stacked bread like bricks of hope. He carried firewood as though each log was a torch against the dark, and he waited, with patience that only love can teach, for the moment when his courage would no longer be silent, but called to act. Captives bring a different kind of weight to a house. They carry silence that is not their own, chains that jingle even when removed, eyes that keep staring at places their bodies cannot reach. At Malfoy Manor, where cruelty had long been polished into habit, such weight thickened the air until even the candles guttered as though ashamed to shine. It was here, in those black marble halls, that the darkest chapter of Dobby's life bent toward its ending. Summoned not by choice, but by ancient bindings still knotted deep in his magic, he felt the pull like a hook in his chest, dragging him back into the place of his old slavery. The walls that had once known his every bowed step seemed to sneer at his return. He clutched his mismatched socks as talismans, whispering to himself that he was not theirs anymore. Yet magic is cruel in its memory. Some doors open for blood alone, and some houses do not forget the names of those who once served within. Inside, fear walked freely. Harry Potter, his friends, and others were trapped, stripped of wands, their voices choked by ropes and curses. Bellatrix's laughter scratched the air like broken glass, and Lucius Malfoy's drawl slithered across the room with old arrogance frayed by desperation. The air smelled of damp stone, dust, and despair. Dobby, trembling, listened from the edges, his heart slamming like fists against a locked chest. The voices of the captors rose and fell. Debates about loyalty, about masters, about rewards. Harry's name was spat like poison, and when Voldemort's shadow was invoked, even the portrait shivered. Dobby's ears rang with terror. But beneath the terror burned that stubborn ember that had lived in him since Privet Drive. Harry Potter must be saved. Summoning an elf is not like summoning a tool. It is a command spoken into marrow, a summoning of old pacts and old chains. Yet Dobby's freedom gave him a sliver of resistance. He could hear their call, but could twist it sideways, appear where they did not expect, slip into corners, rather than fall into hands. He used that gap, that tiny space between command and compliance, to listen, to wait for the right moment. He saw Harry's face bloodied, exhausted, but unbowed. He saw Hermione's pale stillness as she lay cursed and suffering. He saw Ron's fury burning hotter than his fear. He saw Luna's calm eyes, wide with unbroken gentleness. Each sight cut Dobby like a knife, but also stitched him tighter to his choice. He could not allow this house to win. And then an echo from far away. A voice in a mirror. Aberforth's aide reaching through silvered glass. A crack of hope in the dark. Plans whispered, desperate and quick. But hope alone could not unbind ropes or open iron gate. Someone small, someone overlooked, someone like Dobby would have to act. He knew the risk. He knew that stepping forward meant pain, perhaps death. But he remembered every kindness Harry had given him. The smile, the socks, the listening, the simple dignity of calling him by name. And he remembered the promise he had made to himself in Firelight, long ago. When Harry needs me, I will come, no matter the cost. So Dobby, the free elf, the one who had once been punished for the smallest disobedience, gathered himself like a spark gathering into flame. His knees shook, his hands trembled, but his eyes shone steady. The moment had come. And with a snap of his fingers, the air around him shifted, preparing to answer the courage of a creature no one had expected to be brave. Summons can be cruel things, iron hooks cast into the softest parts of a life, but this one arrived like a hand cupped around a match, protecting rather than claiming. It came to Dobby in the hush between kettles, in the brief silence after a pot has decided to simmer and before it begins its cheerful talk. A glimmer bloomed on the underside of a ladle, silver answering silver somewhere far away, and with it a voice that sounded like smoke taught to be kind. Can you hear me, little friend? The words did not bark. They leaned. The mirror that carried them had been split and stitched with stubborn hope, and across that thin seam, Aberforth Dumbledore's gruff mercy crossed as if it knew the route already. The kitchen held its breath. Even the fire bowed its head. Dobby hears, he whispered, as if any louder sound might frighten the moment. He did not ask who called. He knew the shape of concern when it arrived wearing a stranger's boots. Dobby is listening. There's a boy you love trapped where bad habits learn to make themselves furniture, the voice said, plain as bread. There are others with him, and time is not on their side. Can you go? It is a powerful thing to be asked rather than ordered. The question loosened, something that had even in freedom remained knotted. Dobby can, said the elf, and the words stood up inside him, with the old, tall feeling that had first come to him in the marble hall with the sock. Dobby will. No further instructions. No map. Just trust, handed across a thin slice of silver like a candle across a dark threshold. Dobby tied his scarf once, twice. Ritual for luck, and put into his pouch not weapons, but promises. A thimble that thought itself brave, a cloth charmed to become a banner. If courage needed, a flag, a crumb saved from a loaf that had risen particularly well for children who needed to remember that rising was their nature. He pressed his palms to the warm stones of Hogwarts, as a child presses a forehead to a mother's apron, and then he vanished with that neat sideways pop that elf magic makes when it declines to explain itself. Malfoy Manor received him as a house receives a memory it had hoped to misplace. The corridor he chose to enter had disliked daylight, even in summer. Shadows stood at attention along the wainscoting. Portraits affected sleep with theatrical snores. Dobby's breath arrived in small parcels, stationed carefully between the ribs. He knew where steps would creak and taught them to hold their tongues. He knew which doors quarrelled with their knobs and soothed them with a palm. He was not the elf who had left this place in terror. He was the elf who had returned with gentleness sharpened into tool. Down. That was where fear collects. Cellars are its pantry. The stairwell spiraled like a sentence that has decided to end badly. The air grew cooler, then cold. The stones remembered keeping secrets. and seemed almost glad to be of use again. Dobby slipped into the cellar, not as a trespasser, but as a caretaker, checking on a forgotten room. Shackles muttered to the wall in iron. Straw tried to smell like sleep and failed. In the dim, he found eye. Luna's gaze met him first. It was like being regarded by moonlight through branches, soft, precise, as if she had been expecting a small, unlikely solution with exceptionally tidy hands. "Hello, Dobby," she said, as though greeting a familiar star. "We were beginning to hope for you." Hope is a shy animal. When it hears its name spoken calmly, it comes closer. Dobby put a finger to his lips. Habit and necessity. Then to the lock. Elf magic is not argument. It is persuasion. He asked the iron what it wanted to be when it was younger, before it learned to hold. Horseshoe. The metal confessed, embarrassed by its current career. "Then curve again," Dobby murmured, and it did, opening with a sigh of relief. Shackles slithered off wrists, almost grateful to become nearly heavy. "Mr. Ollivander," Dobby breathed, seeing the old wandmaker propped like a spent candle. The man's eyes, weary as wood ash, sparked at the sound. "Ah," he rasped. Help with his own magic. He meant the boy above, the one whose name houses now learned to pronounce like a prayer. Dobby touched the wandmaker's shoulder as one touches a grandfather clock to steady the hour. Dean nodded from the shadows. Stubborn jaw set, dignity intact despite the grime that tried to rewrite it. Griefhook watched with a jeweler's scrutiny, taking the measure of this small phenomenon, freeing bolts with the same courtesy he reserved for gold. Dobby met each gaze, and in meeting, counted his charges, names folding themselves into a list. His heart would not misplace. "Quiet now," he whispered, and quiet obeyed. He coaxed the bolt on the door to remember that it was also a line drawn by a child in a game. And as a line, it was easy to smudge. He closed his eyes briefly, and let the house press its map against his mind. Above, voices congregated, sharp, delighted by the cruelty they had set for supper. He felt the tilt of a dagger's thought, thin and glittering. He felt the tremor in a boy's bones who was refusing to make any more noise than necessary. He held all this, careful as a tray loaded with blue china, and breathed. Plans, like bread, cannot be forced to rise, but they can be offered warmth. "We will not go all at once," Dobby said softly, his words making pockets in the air where a plan could proof. "Small groups, and quickly. Dobby can carry, and Dobby will return. There is a warm room waiting with a goat who disapproves of fuss." Luna's mouth curved. Ollivander closed his eyes as if handed a blanket. Griefhook's glance went flinty and then thoughtful at the mention of safe stone. "Harry?" Luna asked, as if making sure a star was still where the chart promised. Dobby's ears lifted. "Dobby fetches Harry Potter last," he said, aching to say first, and knowing last was wiser. "Harry Potter always holds the door, while others—" Luna accepted this with an understanding tilt, as if she had expected nothing else of the boy or the elf. He reached into the space just to the left of Air, where elfways live, and opened the path to Aberforth's back room, a place that smelled of rough wool and stubborn kindness. The passage yawned invisible. Dobby took Luna's hand, because politeness is never wasted, and with a crack soft as a knuckle on a known door, he conveyed her through. The room murmured hello in the language of tea. A second return, and Mr. Ollivander stepped into warmth. The phoenix-feathered history in his gaze seemed to catch for a moment on the sight of ordinary safety and then settle gratefully. A third trip brought Teen, who tried to thank with words too large for the moment and settled for a handgrip that told the truth quickly. Each journey took a slice of Dobby's strength. He apportioned himself like careful butter, thin but even, determined to last to the edge of the bread. Griefhook delayed. "Deals are the goblin's art and nature. I will go," he said at length, voice like a coin tapped to prove its ring, "but not without my own bargain when the boy arrives." Dobby did not haggle. He was not the boy, and time sizzled like oil in a hot pan. "Come," he said simply. "There is a hearth and a haggling sort of man in the room who will not faint at your conditions." Griefhook allowed himself to be ushered with the dignity of someone who is choosing even when circumstances insist. Returning alone to the cellar, Dobby paused, ear tilted toward the boards above. Noise had discovered itself upstairs. Footsteps began to argue with rugs. A name was shouted, then strangled back into whisper, then shouted again. Bellatrix's laughter cupped the room like cold hands. Dobby moved, small and inevitable, toward the place where the house kept its most dangerous family theatre. On the staircase he met a rat of a man whose hand remembered silver too fondly. The man faltered, seeing the elf as one sees a memory one had buried under the floorboards. Pity that treacherous plant, poked a green tip through the stone of Dobby's resolve. He did not water it. "Move," he said, not unkindly. And the man, tangled in old debts, worse choices, moved as water moves when a glass tips. At the threshold of the drawing room, Dobby became again the servant he had been taught to be, and then used the costume as armor. He entered head bowed, ears abased, hands empty, as if obedience had come when called. Bellatrix's eyes slid over him with the contempt that makes its own blindfold. Lucius sneered in relief. A thing that fit his idea of the world had appeared, and men like him are too grateful for confirmation to check its teeth. Dobby stood where shadow and chandelier both failed to claim the floor, and looked only at the skirts of furniture, eyes unnoticed. Patience is not. "Who summoned you?" Bellatrix demanded, voice finding pleasure in the syllables, as one finds sugar in tea. "Speak, creature." Dobby tasted the command like metal, and swallowed it the way a practiced thief swallows a key. "Dobby is here to serve," he said. The old sentence turned inside out so the lining choice touched his skin. He marked where wands lay, where ropes bit, where Malfoy pride had left itself vulnerable by leaning too long on the arm of a chair that did not actually care for it. He followed the invisible lines of the room's wards, those stitched spells that make a house smug, and found the seam where two old magics overlapped and forgot to watch the air between them. That would be the door. He tucked it in his mind like a folded napkin. A thin voice tried to thread panic into the air from the floor. Hermione's pain frayed it before the stitch held. Ron's syllables collided with their own rage. Harry's breath, steady but climbing, set a rhythm as clear as any march. Not yet, not yet. Now, Dobby slipped away, a ripple returning to the deeper part of the pond, and the house did not notice it had been visited by the future. Back in the cellar, he pressed his forehead briefly to the stone. Houses are complicated creatures. They remember both kindness and cruelty, and will answer to either, if named correctly. "You knew me when I was small," Dobby told the wall, "and I am small still. But my smallness is chosen now. Help." Stone does not nod, but it softened, and that was answer enough. He breathed once, slow, like a baker deciding to let the loaf rise longer, despite hunger banging on the table, and counted the remaining tasks as one counts cutlery before a feast. Remove the last of the prisoners, return for the boy and the wandmaker's future, open the seam at the right second, defeat the dagger's idea of itself. He was not a duelist. He was a mender. But menders know how to turn sharp things into useful ones. Above, the house drew itself taller, preparing for spectacle. Below, a free elf tightened the knot on his scarf and readied a gentleness fierce enough to tear a hole in a cruel evening. He reached into the air where Aberforth's door would open again, at a snap. He set his hands to the task of stealing people, one heartbeat at a time, back into safety, and when at last he lifted his face toward the stairs once more, he carried with him not just a plan, but a promise folded small enough to fit in a pocket and strong enough to hold a life. Very quietly, so as not to break the breath of the moment, Dobby stepped toward the last and hardest part, where courage must learn to move faster than fear without spilling a single soul. The drawing room at Malfoy Manor was a theatre built for cruelty. Its stage set with velvet shadows and a chandelier that glittered like fangs in the dark. Around the long table, the captors waited, faces lit by firelight, eyes sharp with suspicion, voices heavy with threat. In that suffocating air, Harry Potter and his friends stood on the brink of despair, and hope seemed as far away as stars behind storm clouds. And then, almost unseen, almost impossible, Dobby appeared. The elf's arrival was not heralded by noise or flash, but by the softest pop, a sound too small for such a great act of defiance. He stood at the threshold, his scarf loose about his neck, his ears trembling, his eyes wide with the enormity of what he was about to do. He was no longer the elf of the kitchens, nor the slave of Malfoy Manor. He was a free being stepping into the heart of darkness with nothing but love to guide him. His gaze darted across the room, noting ropes, wands and the cruel curve of Bellatrix's smile. He saw Hermione bound and pale, Ron taut with fury, Harry steady despite exhaustion. He saw Draco, conflicted in silence, and Lucius with his hand shaking slightly as if all his certainties were slipping. For a moment, Dobby felt the pull of old magic, the cruel commands that had once bound him to these walls. But freedom burned brighter. His voice rose, small yet clear, and cut through the heated air like a silver thread. Dobby has come to rescue Harry Potter and his friends. Every face turned. Bellatrix shrieked, her laughter turned sharp with fury. "You!" she spat, wand flashing upward. "You dead." But Dobby was already moving. He snapped his long fingers, and with a ripple the chandelier above the table groaned, creaked, and shattered from its chain, plummeting down with a roar of crystal and iron. Screams filled the room as glass exploded in sparks of light, forcing wands downward, breaking lines of aim, giving Harry and the others the heartbeat they needed. "Come," Dobby cried, tugging at ropes, twisting magic, undoing knots with the ease of one who had known servitude too well. Hermione gasped as cords fell away. Ron lunged toward her, shielding her with his arms. Harry met Dobby's gaze just long enough for gratitude to pass between them like flame to tinder. The room erupted in chaos. Shouts, curses, the stamp of boots. Lucius staggered back. Narcissa cried out, and Bellatrix, hair wild, slashed her wand through the dust and smoke. But Dobby was faster, darting like a spark in a gale, vanishing and reappearing at will, slipping past walls of magic that could stop any wizard but not an elf who knew how to twist through seams between spells. Grifuk clutched the sword of Gryffindor. Luna steadied Ollivander. Dean stumbled toward the open seam in the air that Dobby had torn with his power. Again and again, Dobby returned, tugging prisoners into safety, ferrying them through Aberforth's waiting refuge. "Dobby is a free elf," he cried, not in fear, but in triumph, as the drawing room shook with fury. But freedom is a dangerous thing in a house, built on chains. Bellatrix's dagger gleamed in her hand, her arm pulled back with murderous precision. She did not waste a curse. She wanted blood, steel, and silence. She hurled it with all the venom her heart contained. And Dobby, reaching for Harry, did not flinch. The dagger flew, slicing through the air, a streak of silver in the dust and firelight. Time has moments when it slows, when each breath stretches wide enough to hold a whole story. And this was one of them. The drawing room blazed with falling crystal, curses shouted, smoke curling from burning drapes, and in the center of it all a single dagger arched through the air, glittering coldly in the firelight. Harry saw it coming, his body already tense, his mouth opening in a cry, but he was too far, too bound by the heaviness of the moment to stop it. Ron shouted, Hermione gasped, Lucius flinched, and even Draco's eyes widened with something like horror. Bellatrix's laughter rose high and sharp, the sound of someone delighting in cruelty's aim. And then, Dobby. The elf had no wand, no shield, no armor, but his will. He moved not as a warrior, but as a protector, his small form springing forward with an urgency that outpaced thought. His fingers snapped once more, tearing open the seam of safety toward Aberforth's room, and with his other hand he reached for Harry, for freedom, for the future. The dagger struck. It was so small a sound, after so much noise. Just a soft thud, as though it had landed in cloth rather than flesh. But Dobby staggered. His wide eyes blinked, first in surprise, then in pain, and at last in understanding. He had been pierced just below the ribs, where no scarf or sock could soften the blow. The silver blade quivered, proud of its cruelty. Dobby, Harry shouted, lunging forward, catching the elf as he swayed. Around them chaos swirled, screams, spells, the crash of furniture. But Harry's arms closed around Dobby, and in that moment the rest of the world blurred to nothing. With the last of his strength, Dobby snapped his fingers again. The room shivered, the air folded, and in a rush of displaced wind, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Luna, Grifuk, Ollivander, and the wounded elf were pulled out of Malfoy Manor, vanishing just as Bellatrix screamed in rage, and the chandelier groaned against the ruined floor. They landed on sand. Cold, damp air rushed around them, carrying the salt of the sea and the cry of gulls. Shell Cottage rose in the distance, lights flickering like a lighthouse's promise. Harry fell to his knees, cradling Dobby in his arms, the waves murmuring at the edge of the shore as if the earth itself had come to witness. The dagger was gone, left behind in the manor, but its wound remained. Dobby's breaths came hale, each one a tremor, yet his eyes, even through pain, shone with light. He looked up at Harry, his voice weak but steady, carrying the same truth he had lived since the day he first dared to resist. "Such a beautiful place to be with friends," he whispered, his words thin as threads, but strong enough to tie hearts together forever. And the night, heavy with grief, carried him gently onward. The sea held its breath that night. Waves that should have thundered onto the shore seemed to hush themselves, as though unwilling to disturb the small figure lying cradled in Harry's arms. The sand beneath them, damp and cool, bore witness without complaint. Shell Cottage, with its gentle windows glowing like watchful eyes, stood silent, aware that something far greater than shelter was needed here. Harry pressed his hands to Dobby's wound, desperate, his voice breaking with pleas that could not change what was already written. "Stay with me, Dobby. Stay." But the elf's breaths were thin ribbons now, each one shorter, faint. Hermione knelt close, her face pale with sorrow. Ron's hands shook helplessly. Luna's wide, calm eyes glistened as though they saw not only what was ending, but also what it meant. The dagger had done its work swiftly, cruelly. No spell could undo it. No potion could rewind the moment when steel had met flesh. And yet, Dobby did not tremble with fear. He gazed up at Harry with eyes that glowed, still filled with the fierce light of choice. He had chosen this path, chosen to act, chosen to save. His pain was real, but so was his peace. "Harry Potter." His voice was a whisper, like a seashell pressed to the ear. He reached with one trembling hand, and Harry caught it, holding on as though his grip alone could anchor the elf to the world. "Dobby is happy to be with friend." Tears spilled freely down Harry's face, falling onto the sand and into the spaces between Dobby's fingers. No words came to him, none strong enough, none worthy enough. He could only hold the elf closer, as if the warmth of his embrace might gift him one more breath. The waves sighed, the stars shimmered faintly above, and then soft as a candle flame giving way to dawn. Dobby's chest stilled, his eyes wide and shining, dimmed into the peace of sleep. His hand, so small within Harry's, went slack. A silence deeper than any grief followed. It pressed against their hearts, heavy as stone, vast as the ocean before them. Harry bowed his head over the elf's body, his shoulders shaking, his soul aching with a pain he had never known. In the stillness, Luna laid a hand upon Harry's arm, her voice tender, steady as moonlight. "We should bury him, properly, here by the sea." Harry nodded, though his throat could not form words. Gently, reverently, he lifted Dobby in his arms, carrying him further up the beach, where the waves would not disturb him. Each step was heavy with finality, yet softened by the certainty that this elf, this friend, deserved a resting place worthy of his courage. And as the others followed, silent, grief-stricken, the night wrapped itself around them like a cloak, holding close the memory of a life so small in stature, yet so vast in love. The wind came in small, considerate breaths, as if the sea itself were learning bedside manners. It combed Dobby's hair with salt-soft fingers and tugged very gently at Harry's sleeves, the way tides tug at the hems of continents. Above them, the sky had put on its plainest dark, no theatrics of cloud or thunder, only the honest, endless hush in which last words linger like the aftertaste of a hymn. Harry did not let go. Grief is a grasping thing, but in his hold there was more cradling than clutching, as though his arms understood that what needed carrying now could not be carried by strength alone. He bent close to Dobby's face, that dear face with its hills and hollows, and for a long moment said nothing, because nothing said would be enough, and silence had learned, at last, how to be kind. The others stood nearby with the caution of people in a sacred room, Hermione with her hand over her mouth, as if trying to warm the cold from breath, Ron with fists opening and closing as if searching for a spell that could be held, Luna still uncertain, her gaze like a candle that refuses to gutter. "Thank you," Harry whispered at last. And the two words were not small. They were as large as a life. They were everything a boy could give to a friend, who had given everything back. Thank you for choosing us. Thank you for saving me. Again, thank you for being free. The sea, often impertinent, did not interrupt. It pressed its ear to the shore and listened. Hermione knelt and smoothed Dobby's scarf, straightened the brave, ridiculous socks that had made a philosophy of colour. Her tears fell, not hurried, but steady, baptizing wool and skin and sand alike. You were so brave, she said, and her voice found that gentle register it kept for tender creatures and tricky spells. So very brave. Ron swallowed twice before words would trust him again. No one ever did it like you, he managed, voice ragged. You showed all of us. He stopped, because the rest would not push through his throat without breaking something important, and so he let the sentence stand there, bare but true. Luna crouched, tilting her head, as if to see a different angle of the moment. He's gone where socks never lose each other. In the wash, she said softly. And though someone else might have flinched at the strangeness, here it made sense. The way moonlight makes sense on water, where kitchens always smell of cinnamon when you need courage, and kettles sing when you've remembered what you forgot. She looked at Harry then, and her look did not pity. It companioned. He knew you would carry the rest. Freedom, which Dobby had worn like a banner, now wore him. It lifted from the boundaries of his small body like steam leaving a cup, invisible and warming everything it touched. If the night had eyes, and perhaps it did, it might have seen the old packs loosening their ropes, might have seen service lay down its burden and become love alone. Dobby's last breath had been the gentlest of rebellions, not torn from him, not seized, but given as he had given everything that mattered freely. Harry laid Dobby carefully upon the sand, as one sets down a fragile thing in a place that will not dare to jostle it. He brushed a smear of soot from Dobby's cheek with a thumb. The soot came away, but the thumb, for a heartbeat, could not bear to leave the skin it had known so often, animated by mischief and courage. When at last he drew his hand back, it trembled as though it had held lightning. He took off his own jacket and tucked it beneath Dobby's head, not because the elf needed comfort any longer, but because the gesture taught Harry's hands how to go on being gentle in a world that had asked them to be hard. Shell Cottage sent out its light in small squares on the dunes. Hesitant and tender, Bill and Fleur came running, slowed when they saw, then walked the last few steps as people walk in churches. Words were exchanged in the hush, offerings of blankets and water and the right kind of absence. Fleur touched Hermione's shoulder. Bill's hand found Ron's back, and in these simple human bridges, the shock began, slowly to turn into something that could be carried without breaking every step. Here, Harry said after a long while. His voice changed in the way metal changes under flame, softer in some places, truer in others. He gestured to the place where the dune curled up like a sleeping animal, a little hollow cradled by grass that had learned to sing in wind. Let's hear. He did not say bury yet, as if the word would make the leaving too official. He only pointed to a spot that felt like a promise kept. He did not reach for a wand. Wizards do not forget magic. They lay it down when laying it down, says Moore. Harry went to his knees and set his fingers into the sand. It was cold and damp and full of old seashell thoughts, and it gave way beneath his hands with the soft, repetitive mercy of something that understands what it means to make room. He dragged the earth back with his palms, scooped and pushed, and scraped. The skin over his knuckles rasped, then split. Small red moons, blooming and sanding themselves down on grit. Hermione moved to help with her hands too, then glanced at her wand and rested it on the dune, understanding the liturgy. Ron, wordless, dug hard, jaw clenched, breaths coming loud. Luna lifted the loose sand and tipped it neatly aside with a shell, as if aiding a tide that had an appointment. They dug until their wrists ached, until sand crept beneath nails, and time lost interest in clocks. Between scoops, Harry looked up and the stars looked back, old, impartial, many, and he felt, piercing and strange, that Dobby had expanded, that the small body on the shore was only a detail, and the rest of him had slipped into the larger pattern, where kindness does not end. It only changes its address. This thought did not erase grief. It placed grief in a vastness that kept it from drowning the boy holding it, when their hands could not go further without surrendering all sensation, when the hollow in the dune had become a bed that even the earth seemed eager to keep soft. Harry stood and wiped his palms on his muddy jeans. leaving streaks like signatures. He looked to the sea. The sea made its quiet, grateful noises, as if relieved to be trusted with another secret. "We'll lay him down," he said, and the wee relieved something in everyone's faces. He lifted Dobby again, this time, as one lifts a sleeping child from a chair to a nearer, safer room. He lowered him into the shaped sand. The curve of the hollow met Dobby's shoulders, as if the beach had, in some previous life, learned the dimensions of heroism and was pleased to have the lesson put to use. Hermione tucked the scarf more snugly round his neck. Ron smoothed the socks so their mismatched joy faced the sea. Luna laid a shell by Dobby's hand, white and spiraled, a small ear pressed forever to an endless hush. For a long breath, no one moved. The wind tidied their hair. Grief arranged itself in new rooms inside their chests. Bill murmured something in French that sounded like a blessing even if you could not understand it. Fleur answered, voice soft as lace laid upon wood. Harry's mouth opened, and what came out surprised him by being steady. "You saved us," he said simply. "We will make it count." The night did not answer in words. It answered in the way dunes keep shape, even when the top moves. In the way waves continue, because that is their work. In the way hurt can sit beside love, without either one having to prove itself truer than the other. Somewhere inside the cottage a kettle remembered to boil, and the thought felt exactly right. The living had work still, and work, done tenderly, is a way to honor the dead. They began to push the sand back, handful by handful, as if tucking in a friend. Hermione's tears fell onto the dune and disappeared, not erased, but included. Ron cleared his throat roughly every few moments, and did not apologize for the sound. Luna hummed something with no tune, and all comfort. Harry patted the last sweep of sand into place, palms flat, as if smoothing a bed cover. And then, with the heel of his hand, he pressed down once, gently, the way you might soothe a restless dream back into sleep. He did not speak an ending. He did not know one. He only stood a little straighter, as if the air had asked him kindly to share its height. Around him, friends did what friends do when words tire. They stayed. The sea, having held its breath for a long time, exhaled. The stars, unblinking, offered the kind of company that does not intrude. In the hush that followed, the cottage door opened, and a lantern's circle of gold walked down the sand toward them. Its light made a small moon around their grief, not to banish it, but to let the faces be seen. Bill lifted the lantern a fraction higher, and in its glow, Harry noticed, with the sharpness of new sight, how the dune curved like a shoulder, how the grass bowed, as if in respect, how the water's edge kept time without arrogance. He thought then, not in sentences, but in a warmth that came from the direction of courage, that Dobby had not left the world so much as taught it again how to hold those who must stay. The wind turned. It came now from the west, sweeter, as if fields were talking to the sea through it. "Tomorrow," Harry said, almost to himself, almost to the sand, "will mark the place." Hermione nodded. Ron breathed out. Luna looked up as if the sky had just agreed. The night tucked the promise into its pocket, with the care of someone who knows how to return things exactly when needed. And so the hours leaned toward morning, not hastening, not dragging, merely doing what hours do. Harry stood watch, the way one does when a friend has crossed a river, and you remain on the bank, not because there is anything left to change, but because love refuses to leave the water unaccompanied. He did not know what the day would require, only that when the light came up enough to show his hands clearly again, he would use them. For now, the sea stitched and unstitched its lace along the shore. The cottage held its gentle square of glow, and the dune kept a new secret with tender, sandy care as we follow the boy and his friends toward the next kindness, the next necessary gesture, the next word that must be written where the wind can read it. The morning came slowly, as if the sun itself were reluctant to rise over such a night of sorrow. Along the shore, the sea still moved in gentle strokes, carrying the memory of what had been lost. Harry, his eyes heavy with grief, stood before the dune where they had laid Dobby to rest. The sand was smooth, carefully pressed down by hands that had dug until they bled, hands that had carried, cradled, and finally released. He felt a strange stillness in that place, as though the world itself had paused to honor what had been done. Shell Cottage lay quiet behind them, the family within giving space for grief to take its shape. Hermione stood close, her face pale, streaked with lines of dried tears. Ron lingered just a little further back, shoulders stooped as though the weight of guilt and sorrow pressed him down. Luna, serene and luminous, gazed out to sea, her hands folded loosely before her as if she were listening to a song that only she could hear. Harry knelt in the sand, drawing his wand. His voice trembled, but his intention was clear. He began to carve into the earth, not with haste, but with reverence. Each stroke of magic, shaping the words that his heart demanded the world must never forget. Here lies Dobby, a free elf. The letters glowed faintly as they formed. Not grand, not ornate, but pure in their honesty. The words caught the morning light as though written in gold. Though they were only carved in sand, Harry stepped back and let his wand fall to his side. The words standing like a promise that would outlive every breath he took. They stood together in silence. Hermione's hand brushed Harry's, grounding him. Ron cleared his throat once, rough and low, but no words followed. Luna tilted her head and whispered softly, "The sea will remember him too. Every wave will carry his name." Harry closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment he felt that Luna might be right, that every ripple in the water, every grain of sand pressed by the tide, carried forward a fragment of the life Dobby had lived so bravely. He thought back to the first time he had seen him, perched nervously on the bed at Privet Drive, warning him with wide eyes and trembling hands. How strange that moment had seemed. How frustrating and bewildering, and yet, Harry could see it now with piercing clarity. That was when the bond had been forged. Dobby had been misunderstood, dismissed, punished, mocked. Yet, through it all, he had chosen love, chosen defiance, chosen freedom. Now he was gone, and Harry felt the hollowness of that absence, as though a part of his own chest had been cut away. But mingled with the hollow ache was something else. A fire, faint but steady, the fire of gratitude. The fire of resolve. Dobby's story would not end in despair. The others began to drift back toward the cottage, footsteps soft upon the sand, but Harry lingered. He could not yet leave this place, this grave. He sank to his knees once more, pressing a hand flat against the sand where the elf now lay. "I'll keep going," he whispered, voice raw, carried away by the salt wind. "For you, for all of them." And as the waves lapped gently at the shore, Harry stood again, turning toward the path that would lead him back to war, to struggle, to the fight that awaited. Yet behind him, the dune remained, steady and solemn, holding the body of the one who had died free. The sea, the sky, the sand, they would guard that secret forever. Graves are not merely places for the dead. They are mirrors for the living, holding up what we fear, what we love, and what we promise to carry forward. Dobby's grave by the sea became such a mirror, its mound of sand, modest and unadorned, save for the words Harry had carved, seemed to glow with a quiet dignity, as though the morning light itself bowed in respect. Harry stood long after the others had returned to Shell Cottage. His eyes lingered on the carved words. "Here lies Dobby, a free elf." The phrase struck him over and over, not as an ending, but as a beginning. A truth that could not be erased by death, for Dobby had lived enslaved, punished, mocked, and still he had found his way to freedom. Still he had chosen courage. Still he had chosen love. As Harry gazed at the grave, a tide of memories pressed against him. He thought of the sock that had set Dobby free, given almost in jest, yet received as treasure. He thought of the mismatched socks Dobby had collected afterward, each one a banner of freedom. He thought of Dobby's shrill joy, his awkward loyalty, his stubborn refusal to let Harry walk into danger unprotected. Every memory was a stitch, sewing grief and gratitude together into something Harry knew he must wear forever. The wind shifted, carrying salt and the scent of wildflowers from the dunes. Hermione's hand came to rest on his shoulder. She said nothing, but her silence was steady, like a pillar propping up the weight of grief. Ron, standing on Harry's other side, scraped his boot against the sand, his voice thick. He deserved better than this, better than dying with a knife in him. Harry swallowed hard, the bitterness of truth burning his throat. He deserved a life without chains, he whispered, but he got freedom. He died free. and he saved us all. Luna, who had drifted nearer, crouched by the mound, her fingers lightly tracing the words Harry had carved. "You'll be safe now," she said, her voice dreamlike, yet steady. "Elves don't go where people think. They go where kitchens are always warm, and friends are waiting, and no one asks them to hurt themselves for love." She looked up at Harry, her pale eyes shining. "You'll hear us when we remember him." The sea answered with a long, low sigh, pulling foam across the sand as though to bless the grave. In the quiet that followed, Harry felt something settle inside him. It was not peace that would not come, not yet, but it was resolve. Dobby had given his life so that Harry could continue. That sacrifice was a weight, but it was also a torch. He could not, would not, let it fall. "Come on," Harry said at last, his voice firm, though soft. "We'll keep him with us. Always. But we've got work to do." They turned back toward Shell Cottage, their footsteps leaving temporary marks upon the sand. Behind them the grave stood watch, the words upon it etched not only into the earth, but into their hearts. And as the sea rolled endlessly against the shore, the world seemed to whisper the truth that would echo long after. Dobby, a free elf, lived with love, died with courage, and would be remembered with honor. Years later, when war had ended and peace began to find its fragile footing again, the sea still told the story of a small elf who had died free. Shell Cottage remained, its windows glowing softly in twilight, and by the dunes where the grass bent in the wind, the mound of sand had become something more permanent. Stones had been placed carefully, flowers often rested there, and though waves came close on stormy nights, they never touched the grave, as if the sea itself had sworn to protect it. Wizards and witches, who passed through after the war, would pause at the spot. Some had known him, some had not, but all bowed their heads before the words carved into stone. "Here lies Dobby, the free elf." For in those words was not only the end of a life, but the echo of a lesson that even the smallest, humblest creature can choose love over fear, freedom over chains. Harry came often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Ginny, sometimes with his children. When the years had softened grief into story, he would sit by the grave and tell them of the elf who had saved him, who had worn socks like banners, who had spoken truth in the face of cruelty. He was small, Harry would say, his voice gentle, but his courage was greater than any spell I've ever known. Hermione visited too, leaving flowers and quiet words. She carried Dobby's memory into her work, fighting for the rights of house elves, determined that his sacrifice would not remain singular. Ron came less often, but when he did, he lingered long, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the sea, as if speaking silently to a friend he had learned too late to understand. Luna came with shells, laying them in spirals, whispering that Dobby was listening, always listening, from a place where socks never lost their pair. The elves of Hogwarts, too, knew his story. Some still whispered with unease, but others slowly began to see in his name, not disgrace, but possibility. And though none said it aloud, the presence of mismatched socks, tucked away in corners, grew more common, like secret flags of quiet rebellion. The sea never ceased its hymn. Each wave carried forward the memory of a life that had burned so brightly in love that even death could not dim it. And on nights when the wind howled and the stars gleamed fiercely above, it seemed the world itself was repeating his truth, that freedom, once chosen, cannot be undone. And so the story closes, not in sorrow but in remembrance. Dobby's life, humble in its beginning, became radiant in its end. He was a servant once, punished for kindness, mocked for hope, yet he died a friend, a rescuer, a hero, wrapped not in chains but in the boundless sky of choice. Here lies Dobby, a free elf, and in those words leaves the echo of freedom, a lullaby that the sea will carry forever, rocking gently the memory of the elf who loved, who chose, who was free. Welcome, young wizard. Tonight we follow the story of one of the bravest, kindest and most unforgettable creatures ever to walk the halls of Hogwarts. Dobby, the house elf. He was small in stature, with wide eyes and a trembling voice, yet his courage burned brighter than many great wizards. From the chains of the Malfoy household, to the freedom of a single sock, from the secret kindnesses he offered in shadows, to the ultimate sacrifice he made beneath the stars, Dobby's life was a tale of love, loyalty, and choice. This is not just the story of a servant, but of a friend who stood against cruelty, who defied masters, who protected Harry Potter when others would not, and who showed the world that even the humblest among us can be heroes. So breathe slowly, let the night grow gentle, and listen as we walk step by step through the entire story of Dobby the Free Elf.